Her abusive ex broke into her garden, so she smashed his face with a trowel. Gavin thought he could just show up and claim Mara was still his property. But he forgot she's now under the protection of Dante Veyron, a man who built an empire on fear. Before Dante could even unleash his violent rage, Mara took her freedom into her own hands and drew blood first. This isn't just a Mafia romance. It's a brutal story of a victim striking back. Let us pull back the curtain on Dante Veyron, a man who carved his empire out of blood and silent terror. You and I are going to step into the cold shadows of his world together. At 4 a.m, the ruthless machinery of his mind hits a wall. He wakes to the sound of his new bride, Mara, weeping in the pitch black. "Please, do not hit me," she whispers. Their marriage is barely 3 weeks old, a mere signature to secure territory. But watching her tremble wakes a dark, ancient ownership in his chest. Life teaches us a hard lesson. Trauma never vanishes just because the scenery changes. Dante does not reach out. He simply sits in the heavy gloom, watching her breathe, cataloging every flinch. By sunrise, his men will hunt the ghost of Gavin Vale, the man who broke her first. By the time the first grey light bleeds through the window, this predator makes a silent vow that alters both their fates. But right now, in the suffocating darkness, he remains anchored to the mattress. He drinks in the sheer depth of her agony with cold eyes. We are going to look closely at this moment together, watching a monster try on the unfamiliar mask of a protector. Sometimes, human nature forces us to trade one locked cage for another just to survive. Dante does not move a single muscle. He sits perfectly still in the dark trousers and half-open shirt from a late meeting. Silver moonlight catches the sharp, unforgiving angle of his jaw. He watches her with the intense focus of a man analyzing a bleeding creature in a desperate to figure out exactly how the brutal trap was set. The massive bedroom is swallowed by shadows, save for a thin slice of amber street lamp light cutting through the heavy velvet curtains. The city sleeps outside, blind to the tragedy playing out inside. Mara twists violently beneath the tangled silk sheets. Her breathing grows ragged, chest heaving as if she is out of air. Her pale fingers claw at the dark, fighting off unseen ghosts. "I am sorry," she chokes out. A muscle ticks in Dante's jaw, a tiny crack in his iron armor. He spent 6 months tearing apart her files before the altar. She was supposed to be a simple pawn on a chessboard, a quiet bride to stop a street war. Yet, life proves time and again that we can never truly control the unpredictable reality of another human heart. A man like him demands a perfect reflection. Having a respectable bride gave Dante the clean public face needed to run his empire. The arrangement was built to be empty and perfectly safe. But 3 weeks in, the ice is fracturing. Mara lets out another sharp gasp. Slowly, Dante reaches out into the dark. His movements are quiet, understanding a sudden shift would terrify her. His large hand hovers just an inch above her trembling shoulder. He speaks her name. The reaction is instantaneous. She flinches so hard she almost throws herself off the bed. She jerks awake, sucking in air like someone dragged from a frozen lake. Her eyes are blown wide, frantically searching the shadows for a ghost. It is a heartbreaking truth that the most inescapable prisons are the ones we carry inside our minds. Her wild eyes lock onto his hovering hand, bracing for a blow before darting up to his face. The naked horror in her expression hits Dante like a physical strike to the ribs. It is a strange pang of feeling for a man whose heart usually pumps ice water. She rips her arm away, pressing her spine against the headboard. She blurts out, the raw panic in her throat giving away the lie. "I am sorry for waking you. You did not," he replies. his voice perfectly flat. She pushes her tangled hair back with trembling fingers, pleading with him to go back to sleep. But Dante stays exactly where he is. The silver light catches her shrinking into the corner of the mattress. He watches how she desperately tries to make herself disappear. When a person is hurt long enough, shrinking into nothing becomes a tragic survival instinct. Dante knows fear intimately. He has seen the sharp terror of men staring down the barrel of his gun. But this is different. This is a rotting dread hammered into a person over years of silent torture. How often, he asks, the words dropping like stones. Her body goes stiff. How often do you have these nightmares? She does not say a single word. Instead, she pulls the thick duvet up to her chin, clutching it like armor, and stares blankly at a dark spot on the wall. It shows a grim truth of human nature. We hide our deepest wounds when exposing them has only ever brought us pain. Dante lets out a long, measured breath. He pushes himself off the mattress, walks slowly to the heavy wooden vanity, and pours a glass of cold water. He sets it gently on the table beside her. Drink, he tells her softly. Here is a hard truth about human nature. The most dangerous people know exactly how to look harmless. Dante drops down, crouching beside the bed so his eyes are level with hers. It is a calculated move to make her feel safe. He speaks her name, stripping the harsh edge off his deep voice. I am not Tim, he whispers. Her ragged breathing stops. For a split second, you and I might expect the emotional dam to break, for the tears to fall and the truth to spill out. But the walls of trauma are always built too high. Her jaw clamps shut, and she turns her face toward the shadows. The silence stretches, heavy and thick. Seeing the iron cage she built around her mind just to survive her past, Dante slowly stands back up. He tells her quietly to get some rest until the sun comes up. Down in the basement, Dante locks himself in his private study. The air is thick with the scent of old money, rich leather, mahogany, and cigar ash. He pulls up Mara's files on his monitor. Before tonight, he analyzed her past through the cold eyes of a conqueror, hunting for soft spots to bend her to his will. That is simply how a ruthless mind operates. But tonight, the rules have changed. He is no longer looking for leverage. He is looking for blood. He scrolls through the pages. Her records are almost too perfect. Raised in a quiet northern town, she earned top degrees and spent 3 years as a beloved teacher. It is a terrifying truth how quickly one toxic connection can destroy a beautiful life. She met Gavin Vale, and the bright spark of her history went pitch dark. The true ghost haunting these files is the man who owned her before. Gavin Vale is 36, the golden boy CEO of a shipping empire, sitting on $40 million. On paper, the man looks like a saint. 0 arrests. He wears the magnetic smile of a man who knows how to buy the world. To high society, Vale is an untouchable king, but Dante knows the dark side of humanity. He digs deeper, breaking open the sealed divorce papers. The split was handled with chilling perfection. Vale threw a massive fortune at Mara, locking her silence behind an ironclad contract. It is a bitter life lesson that wealth is too often used as a shield for absolute cruelty. It is the oldest trick in the book, a heavy bag of cash used to legally bury a mountain of bruised ribs and bleeding lips. A text message drops into the digital underworld, waking the beast. His right-hand man, Luca, answers the encrypted line on the first ring. Dante skips the greetings. He orders an absolute teardown of Gavin Vale's life, demanding every buried hospital record, every erased police report, every whisper of dirt. He wants it before the sun touches the skyline. Luca hesitates, pointing out that gives them less than 4 hours to hack the impossible. Dante does not care. With ice in his veins, He tells Luca to start digging or start bleeding, then cuts the call. Sitting alone in the glow of the monitor, Dante cannot stop hearing Mara's broken voice echoing in the dark room. Please do not hit me. The most painful scars a person carries are rarely visible on the skin. They are burned permanently into the soul. At 5:47 in the morning, Luca pushes through the heavy doors, looking like he just survived a war. He rubs his eyes, admitting Vile paid fixers millions to scrub his history. But violent men always leave a trail of blood. Dante snatches the files and begins his dark work. The first piece is a hospital intake sheet from 4 years ago, listing a shattered wrist and severe rib bruising. The doctor clearly noted that her story about falling down the stairs made no sense. He saw the terrifying truth. Yet, the system looked the other way. We fail our fellow humans the most when we choose comfortable silence over difficult intervention. They let a bleeding woman walk right back out the sliding glass doors into the waiting arms of her tormentor. The next page turns my stomach. Stick with me. This is where the tragedy takes root. It is a police report from 6 months later. 2 cops stood in their foyer, noting the dark purple bruises around Mara's neck. And Gavin Vale? He stood perfectly calm, claiming his wife drank too much wine and took a bad stumble. Caught in the suffocating grip of fear, Mara nodded along. She swallowed the horrific lie to stay alive, and the cops walked away. It is a devastating truth that the worst monsters hide comfortably in broad daylight. After that, the timeline speeds up. The files show a massive concussion, defensive cuts, and a terrifying silence. She refused to tell the hospital staff who hurt her. The papers spread across the desk paint a picture of absolute, inescapable hell. The lens tilts down to the mahogany desk, settling on a hidden therapist's note. The clinical ink bleeds into a tragic portrait of a woman buried alive by terror. Terrified she would be murdered if she ever packed a bag, she is framed as a broken bird, wings clipped by fear. It is a bitter lesson we all face. True cruelty does not just fracture bones. It completely suffocates the human will to escape. The light dims as Dante shuts the heavy folder. He sits in the dead silence of the room, drawing long, jagged breaths to slow the violent hammering in his chest. Luca stands trembling in the shadows, waiting for a verdict. Slowly, Dante lifts his gaze, his eyes entirely black and hollow. Find his exact location, he whispers to the dark. Let us examine this tragic frame together, you and I. The camera pushes close on Dante's profile. Men of his nature never call the authorities. They draft their own laws in blood. He slides a black phone across the desk, letting it clatter against Luca's shaking fingers. Set the bait before midnight, Dante murmurs. Luca hesitates, asking what lie will draw the rat out. Shadows carve deep canyons into Dante's cheeks. Tell him an old friend wants to catch up. We cut sharply to 9 o'clock. The harsh lighting softens as Mara drifts into the shot, drowning in a faded sweater like a ghost haunting her own memory. We learn a hard lesson from her posture. The soul cannot heal until the monsters we hide from are dragged, kicking and screaming, into the blinding light. The focus shifts to Mara, catching the devastating architecture of her sheer exhaustion. Her clothes hang loosely on a frame shattered by years of invisible terror. When Dante steps into the dim glow of the kitchen, watch how her shoulders flinch before her brain registers his presence. She drifts to the far edge of the cold marble island, erecting a silent wall. The sharp rustle of Dante folding his newspaper pierces the quiet air. He leans forward, his voice a low rumble, demanding the real reason she married him. Her knuckles turn bone white against her mug, her eyes glued to the floor. The tragedy here is painfully simple. Running blindly from the monster in your closet only guarantees that it will hunt you until the end of your days. He rejects her delicate lies instantly. The camera locks onto Dante's eyes, rigid and cold, pulling the raw truth from her throat. She whispers her desperate need for a safe harbor, but the air turns to lead when he demands a name. Who hurt you? Her hand trembles so violently she must set the mug down before it shatters into pieces. She tries to brush the question away, but Dante steps into the frame with the terrifying grace of a wolf circling a wounded bird. He halts just an inch from her boundary. To him, this is no noble rescue. It is a dark matter of damaged property. It is an ugly reality we often ignore. What appears to be a knight in shining armor is frequently just another dragon, hiding a violent obsession behind the sweet illusion of protective care. She tries to build a barricade out of their marriage contract, a paper shield against his heavy gravity. Dante simply ignores it. The camera pushes in, suffocatingly close as his fingers reach out, tilting hurt to force her gaze. The dim kitchen light catches warm tears. Spilling down her cheeks not of sorrow, but of helpless anger. She does not want his dark salvation, but Dante holds the final ace. With brutal precision, he tells her he already knows everything. He drops his name like a stone. Gavin Vale. Every drop of color drains from her terrified face. It is a devastating truth of human nature. When someone violently rips open the darkest secret you have ever buried, it feels much less like salvation and entirely like dying. The geometry of the room fractured completely. As Dante claims her tragic history as his own, Mara stumbles backward, sickened by the violent invasion. She accuses him of crossing a sacred line, but in his twisted logic, he is the sole guardian. Suddenly, her weak defenses turn to ash. She collapses into tears, admitting he was only meant to be a human shield. Through bitter sobs, she whispers that he was never supposed to care. The lens lingers on Dante's shadowed face as he quietly admits that he does. Her wide eyes fill with a heartbreaking, pure confusion. It reminds us of a fragile human paradox. For a soul that has been shattered, being truly seen by another is what they desperately crave most and what they fear above absolutely all else. Dante's voice drops into the chilling register of a man who makes massive problems disappear. He demands she place her nightmare completely in his bloody hands. The camera cuts to a tight shot of her fingers, locked together to hide their violent trembling. When she asks what he intends to do, he speaks of a dark reckoning long overdue. He steps fully into her personal space. Her desperate eyes dart around the shadows, weighing the danger of this man against the ghost of her abuser. He pulls her in, and her spine goes rigid. But then, the crushing agony of running finally breaks her. She collapses against his chest, weeping. We see this tragedy often. When you sprint from a raging fire for years, sheer exhaustion will always force you to seek shelter in the arms of the nearest demon. Watch closely as Dante buries his face in her hair, whispering a horrifying promise of absolute bloodshed. Mara goes still, her eyes slipping shut, as she surrenders to this terrifying sanctuary. The scene cuts violently. The soft domestic lighting is shattered by the sick, yellow glow of a rotting warehouse. The air hangs heavy with the stench of rust and rain. Dante arrives exactly at midnight, stepping out of the dark like a wolf, leading his pack. Inside the concrete tomb, Gavin Vale is waiting. He brushes invisible dust from his sleeve. No sweat, no panic. He is simply annoyed by the late hour. His tailored suit is entirely flawless. Let this cinematic frame be a warning. The devil does not carry a pitchfork. He wears a custom suit, a dazzling smile, and the polished armor of ordinary success. The camera tilts up Gavin's frame, highlighting the sickening perfection of his posture. His expensive clothes are weaponized to project trust, wrapping a deeply violent core in a beautiful shell. Dante's jaw tightens. The thick hatred in the damp room is almost suffocating. Gavin flashes a bright smile, his voice dripping with the fake warmth of an old friend. Dante halts 10 feet away, while his men silently melt into the shadows to block every exit. Gavin's arrogant smirk only grows as he makes a careless joke about bad real estate. Dante says nothing, just staring as if diagnosing a terminal disease. It reveals a chilling reality of human darkness. When a man lives his entire life without ever facing a single consequence, he genuinely views a loaded gun as nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Dante shatters the hollow silence with just one word: Mara. The camera snaps to a microscopic twitch beneath Gavin's eye before his plastic mask locks back into place. He sighs, waving their marriage away as a mutual mistake, the exact lie all abusers recite to sleep at night. He asks why Dante even cares. Dante's voice drops to a lethal growl, stating that her life now belongs to him. Gavin bursts into laughter, mocking Dante's criminal empire, asking if Mara knows the monster she married. The camera pushes in on Dante's dead eyes. He softly asks if Mara knew the monster she married the very first time. Gavin's smile dies instantly. The polished executive vanishes, and the sociopath steps out. Remember this dark lesson. An abuser's ultimate vulnerability is the sudden, violent exposure of their true face. Gavin is playing a high-stakes game he lost hours ago. Dante casually tosses a thick medical file onto the wet concrete, forcing the golden boy to look at his own sins. Gavin recoils, refusing to touch the paper, terrified the ink will make his violence real. Dante begins to recite the horrors aloud. Smashed ribs, hidden hospital visits. He slaughters Gavin's delusion of perfection, trembling. Gavin falls back on the pathetic shield of the elite, stammering about privacy laws and lawyers. Dante takes one slow step forward, erasing the very concept of law from the room. The lens tracks Gavin's polished shoes, taking a frantic step back as animal fear bleeds into his eyes. There is a brutal poetry here. The illusion of power shatters the exact second a predator realizes polite society can no longer save him. Stick with me here to observe the dark architecture of true intimidation. Dante does not need to throw a single punch. His sheer proximity sucks the oxygen out of the damp air. He delivers his final terms in a dead, hollow monotone. Total erasure. Gavin must liquidate his fortune, vanish entirely, and never breathe Mara's name again. The demand is absolute. The camera tilts to catch Gavin's face, burning a violent, panicked red. His fragile ego rejects the concept of surrender. When Dante steps close, promising that failure guarantees a quiet grave, Gavin finally snaps. He starts screaming wild lies, calling his victim insane, desperately gaslighting a ghost. It is a pathetic reality. When you back a dangerous narcissist into a dark corner with no exit, the truth is always the very first thing they murder. Today, you and I step into the cold shadows of human cruelty. The camera pushes in on Gavin as he desperately tries to rewrite history, painting his victim as deeply unstable. But his manipulation shatters under sudden violence. Dante does not utter a single syllable. His heavy hand simply locks around Gavin's throat, choking off the air. Harsh lighting catches the sheer terror blooming in Gavin's bloodshot eyes. The predator is instantly reduced to gasping prey. Luca steps forward, but Dante raises one steady finger to freeze him, applying just enough pressure to make Gavin claw uselessly at his own neck. He drops the man to the concrete, granting him 24 hours to vanish. As Dante walks away, Gavin screams that Mara is entirely incapable of love. It reminds us of a tragic truth. When a coward loses physical control over you, he will always try to assassinate your psychological worth instead. The camera lingers on Dante's silhouette. Gavin's parting words are a masterclass in sadistic projection, labeling Mara as permanently broken to poison Dante with his familiar venom. Dante stops walking. The frame captures his shoulders tensing, the heavy wool of his coat pulling tight as he violently suppresses the urge to turn around and end the man's life. He issues a final warning into the freezing air. If he ever sees Gavin again, there will be absolutely no mercy. Leaving the narcissist bleeding in the alley, Dante does not go home. He drives the empty, rain-slicked streets for 2 solid hours, letting the biting wind rush through the open window to cool his raging pulse. Gavin's smug smile keeps flashing in his mind like a twisted nightmare. The lesson here is quiet but heavy. A truly toxic person leaves a stain so deep that it can easily infect even the strongest, most guarded heart. With every passing mile, Dante's urge to turn the car around and commit brutal murder grows heavier. Yet, he actively fights his darkest nature. The single variable changing his violent habits is Mara. For a man accustomed to absolute dominance, putting a woman's fragile peace above his own burning rage is a monumental shift. He arrives at his guarded compound just as the pale morning sun breaks. Inside the dim room, he finds Mara exactly where he left her. She wears the same clothes, her body terrifyingly stiff, her eyes dark and hollow. She holds her shattered mind together by simply refusing to move an inch. The second he steps into the room, she asks only one chilling question. She wants to know if Gavin is dead. We must understand something profound about the human spirit here. To a victim trapped in an endless cycle of terror, the physical death of their monster often feels like the only real guarantee of permanent safety. The camera focuses tightly on Mara's pale lips. Her voice carries absolutely no emotion. It is the flat, hauntingly hollow sound of a woman coldly calculating her chances of survival. Dante stops dead in the doorway, admitting in a gravelly whisper that keeping Gavin alive took every ounce of restraint he possessed. She simply stares down at her porcelain cup, using the fragile object to avoid the crushing reality that her personal nightmare is still breathing. Dante mentions his strict ultimatum, fully believing in his own absolute power. But Mara intimately knows how the pitch-black mind of an abuser works. They do not walk away. They escalate. She violently slams her cup down against the mahogany table, revealing a sudden, terrifying burst of the chaotic storm raging inside her chest. She warns Dante that he is severely underestimating the enemy. The life lesson here is written in blood. Assuming a cornered predator will simply surrender is the fastest way to become its next casualty. The scene feels suffocating as Mara desperately tries to rationalize her survival. I know what he is, but he doesn't know what I am. Not yet. She looks up at Dante, the stark lighting catching a face trapped between profound relief and agonizing grief. Why are you doing this? She begs. Dante takes a slow, deliberate step forward. The camera tracks his gaze, watching the shallow, panicked rise and fall of her chest, the involuntary trembling in her pale hands. Because you are mine to protect, he rumbles. It sounds exactly like a ruthless man claiming a piece of stolen property. She stiffens immediately, her defensive walls slamming back up. I am not a possession. Dante frowns, the hard muscles in his jaw ticking tightly. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Dante lets out a heavy, defeated breath. He speaks the brutal language of violence flawlessly, yet he cannot find the simple words for this fierce need to keep her safe. It teaches us something deeply human. Sometimes the heart wakes up so suddenly, the mind completely forgets how to speak. The tragic flaw of this hardened man is that Dante simply lacks the emotional vocabulary for this tender moment. "I meant," he says, his deep voice strictly controlled, "that when you agreed to marry me, you became my responsibility. I do not take that lightly." Mara lets out a painfully broken laugh that echoes in the quiet room. It is the haunting sound of a woman betrayed far too many times. "Responsibility? That is what I am to you?" Dante reacts instantly. "No." The solitary word fires back way too fast, bleeding with ruthless desperation. He forces his breathing to slow down. "No. You are more than that." The heavy silence that follows is suffocating. Mara studies his shadowed face, searching the hard lines of his jaw for the cruel lie she expects to find. Her traumatic past has trained her body to always brace for the backhand. "I do not know how to believe you," she whispers. Dante firmly holds his ground. "Then don't. Not yet. Just let me prove it. Trust is never a given right. It is a fragile house built brick by careful brick." Let's pause and watch the subtle shift in her posture. When she opens her eyes, the warm tears spill over her lashes. "I am so tired," she whispers, her fragile voice cracking under the crushing weight of exhaustion. "I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of always looking over my shoulder. I am tired of pretending I am fine." She buries her wet face in her trembling hands, moving purely on primal instinct. Dante swiftly crosses the dark room and pulls her tightly against his broad chest. The most telling cinematic detail? She does not flinch. She simply collapses into the heavy wool of his coat, her slender shoulders shaking violently as years of terror pour out. "Then stop pretending," he murmurs deeply into her hair. "Not with me," she gasps for air. "What if he comes back?" "He won't." Dante gently lifts her trembling chin, forcing her to look up into his fierce eyes. Her defensive walls are completely gone. The lesson here is beautiful. True healing can only begin in the exact moment we finally allow ourselves to violently shatter in the arms of someone safe. The camera pushes in close. In this beautifully broken state, Mara is finally real. "If he comes back," Dante says, his deep voice dropping to a dark, lethal hum, "I will end him, and you will never have to see his face again." "That is not what I want," she replies softly. "Then what do you want?" Her fragile voice is barely a breath. "I want to stop being afraid of him." "You will." Dante looks down at her tear-stained face. "Because I have seen exactly what you are made of. Fear does not last forever. It just hasn't figured out you are infinitely stronger than it yet." She stares up at him for a long, quiet moment before resting her exhausted forehead against his solid chest. "Do not let me down," she begs, her voice shaking. "I won't." We cut to black. 72 agonizing hours pass. Gavin stays exactly where he is, stubbornly refusing to run, while Dante's armed men quietly watch his every move from the shadows. True courage isn't the absence of terror. It is standing in the cold dark and choosing to face the absolute worst monsters anyway. The scene shifts to the cold city. Gavin goes about his life as if nothing happened, wearing a perfect mask of normality. But make no mistake, this is a calculated game. It is an arrogant display of psychological power, proving he won't be chased away. Luca brings the disturbing news to Dante, his face deeply worried under the harsh office lights. "He is not moving," Luca says. "He filed papers to grow the business. He renewed his lease. He is making a deliberate point." Dante sits behind his massive desk, the muscles in his clenched jaw ticking rhythmically. Has he tried to call Mara? Not directly, but he is asking mutual friends from when they were married. He wants to know exactly where she is, if she is happy. Stick with me here, because this detail deeply matters. We are watching the creeping phase of a dangerously obsessed stalker. We must always remember this crucial lesson. A predator's silence is never true peace. It is simply the quiet time they use to sharpen their knives in the dark. The camera focuses on Dante's hands as they slowly curl into heavy fists. His entire body physically reacts to the looming threat. Put more men on him. I want to know everywhere he goes. It is pure paranoia disguised as a cold tactical plan.
Already done, Luca says, hesitating by the door.
Boss, if he is not going to leave, I know. Then what is the play here? Dante leans back in his leather chair, his dark eyes instantly going dead and distant. We wait. For what? For him to make a fatal mistake. Luca frowns. And if he doesn't? A chilling, completely empty smile slowly spreads across Dante's scarred face. Then we make him. Later that night, Dante makes a bold choice to push Mara, forcing her to confront her deepest fears by taking her out to a highly public dinner. She fights it, her voice violently shaking, but his quiet, unstoppable will gently overpowers her panic. Growth is rarely a gentle process. Sometimes the absolute only way out of the suffocating darkness is to be firmly pushed directly into the terrifying light. The cinematic stage for this exposure is Aurelios, a glittering restaurant built exclusively for the elite. The sweeping glass walls offer a dizzying view of the neon-lit city below. It is a space built on the strange illusion of being totally seen while remaining perfectly untouchable. To ensure her safety, Dante has rented the entire top floor. As the elevator doors part, Mara drifts cautiously to the dark edges of the room. She wears a simple black silk dress, trying so hard to remain an invisible ghost. Her pale reflection in the cold glass looks undeniably haunted. Her nervous system is screaming that she does not belong in this light. You didn't have to do this, she whispers, nervously, testing the waters to see what he wants in return. Dante steps close to her, his massive presence acting as a heavy shield against the world. I wanted to, he rumbles. It reminds us of a simple truth. You can never truly realize your own immense worth while you are constantly trying to hide away in the suffocating shadows. Let us look at this cinematic framing together, you and I. The camera lingers on Mara's pale face, bathed in the warm amber light of the dining room. Why? She asks softly, the word hanging in the empty space. Because you deserve at least one night where you are not constantly looking over your shoulder, he replies. She stares at him, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden spark of defiance. You realize that is deeply ironic coming from you. How so? He asks. You are the one man in this city who should always be looking over his shoulder. Dante offers a rare, fleeting ghost of a smile, maybe, but not tonight. They settle into a secluded leather booth by the rain-slicked window. A quiet waiter leaves their drinks and vanishes. In the heavy silence, Maya leans in, searching for the hidden crack in his armor. Why did you really agree to marry me? The real reason. He slowly swirls the amber liquor in his crystal glass, the ice clinking like a tiny, lonely bell. I needed someone who would not ask questions. Someone who would not try to change me, Dante says, his voice is a low rumble. It is a quiet tragedy, craving acceptance without accountability. Mara watches him, a slight tremor catching her lip. And you thought I was that person? His rigid posture softens just a fraction. I thought you understood that people do not fit into neat boxes. Her gaze drops to the scarred table, her walls finally crumbling. I married you because I was running. You were supposed to be temporary. Yet life teaches us that our most permanent anchors often begin as temporary choices. Dante leans closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I know, he murmurs, but you are not temporary, and neither is this. Mara's breath hitches in her throat, her chest rising and falling in the heavy air. I do not know how to do this. Do what? This? Mara gestures to the narrow space separating them. I spent 3 years in a marriage where I learned to make myself small, to apologize for breathing, to measure every single word, because if I got it wrong, she swallows hard. I do not know how to be a wife to someone who is not trying to break me. Here is the tragedy of a bruised spirit. Pure kindness often feels like a trap. Dante reaches across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. She flinches, a tiny, involuntary jerk, but she does not pull away. Then do not be a wife, he advises, his tone a grounding rumble. Just be Mara. Tears spill over her lashes, gleaming in the faint light. What if that is not enough? It is. She grips his fingers with desperate strength. He used to say things like that at the beginning. He made me feel like I mattered. And then Mara's voice cracks, shattering like brittle glass. Everything changed. We see this tragic cycle so often in life, where a golden pedestal slowly morphs into an iron prison. I am not him, Dante replies, his expression carved from stone. How do I know? She whispers. Dante leans forward, the harsh lighting cutting across his face. Because I do not know how to be a good husband. I do not know how to be soft. I have spent my entire life being ruthless, being the monster people fear. He pauses, the weight of his blood past filling the room. But with you, I want to try. Her breathing stops entirely. A tear escapes, and she scrubs it away, ashamed of her own enduring hope. I am falling in love with you, Dante confesses. The words sound entirely foreign on his tongue, raw and bleeding in the shadowed space. Let us pause here, you and I. Think about how terrifying it is to drop your shield while standing in an active war zone. For a predator like Dante, this total vulnerability is destabilizing. I do not know when it started, he admits. Maybe the night I heard you crying. But it is happening, and I cannot stop it. Mara sits entirely frozen. Her lips part, yet no sound emerges. You do not have to say anything, he offers, granting her the gentle illusion of choice. You do not have to feel the same way. Her pale hands tremble against the mahogany table. No, it is not okay, she whispers, carrying a sorrow so profound it aches to witness. Because I think I am falling too, and that terrifies me. A sharp, unfamiliar tightness grips Dante's chest. Why? He asks. Because the last time I loved someone, he destroyed me. And I do not know if I can survive that again. This is the paralyzing fear of a battered soul, the threat of total ruin. You will not have to, Dante commands, a fierce edge returning to his tone. You cannot promise that. I can try. A jagged laugh escapes her throat, caught between despair and surrender. You are impossible. So I have been told. She looks at their intertwined fingers, feeling danger and safety tangled together. What happens now? She asks. Now, Dante murmurs. We take it one day at a time. The camera fades, opening on a sequence of quiet, healing weeks. Mara kneels in the damp garden dirt, planting fragile roses. She seeks the morning sun, showing us how we must actively root ourselves back into the living world. Above, Dante watches from the high window, a quiet ache in his chest as color finally returns to her pale cheeks. The camera captures Mara at her desk, teaching her seminars again. In the shadowed hallway, Dante listens to her voice. It is bright, finally stripped of the guarded monotone she wore like heavy armor. Frame by frame, the rigid tension melts from her spine. She stops flinching when he enters, and the screaming night terrors slowly fade. It is a vital lesson for us all. The human heart will always heal if given a truly safe place to rest. But in this dark world, peace is fragile. The ultimate storm arrives as Serafina Veyron, 83 and draped in black silk, She is the only creature Dante actually fears. Serafina takes one calculating look at Mara and declares her far too thin and launches a ruthless interrogation. She force-feeds the girl rich pasta, surgically dissecting Mara's mental defenses to unearth her true motives. Let us examine this scene together, shall we? Picture the ancient matriarch leaning across the table, her heavy accent dropping like a velvet hammer. "You love him?" she demands. Mara stammers, offering a weak deflection.
"We are complicated."
Serafina waves a dismissive, ring-clad hand. "Love is always complicated. That is not what I asked." Across the room, Mara locks eyes with Dante. The legendary predator leans against the doorframe, fighting a desperate urge to smile. "Yes," Mara confesses in a fragile whisper. Serafina nods slowly. "Good. He needs a strong anchor to keep his humanity before he becomes his father. And his father was a true bastard." Dante grumbles a low protest from the shadows. Yet, confronting our deepest truths always sets us free. Later that night, the camera tracks Mara walking to his dim study, lingering in the doorway with a soft, undeniable smile. "Your grandmother is terrifying," Mara whispers, stepping into the amber light of his office. "I know," Dante replies, lifting his gaze. "Everyone complies eventually." Mara closes the distance, bravely perching on the edge of his mahogany desk. "She told me you used to steal cookies." Dante drags a rough hand down his face, groaning at the sudden exposure. "She also told me you wept the day your father died." A violent shadow of ancient pain flashes across his dark eyes. "She talks too much," he mutters, retreating behind his walls. Yet true love demands we see the beauty beneath the scars. "She loves you," Mara counters, her tone gentle. She reaches out, her fingers wrapping around his scarred hand. "You are a good man, Dante, even if you refuse to believe it." Under the warmth of her steady gaze, his impenetrable armor seems to melt into the floorboards. "I am trying to be," he breathes. She leans down, pressing her lips to his. The kiss is slow, built upon a fragile foundation of newly earned trust. But we must remember, tragedy is a silent predator that strikes exactly when you finally feel safe. It happens on an unremarkable Wednesday. The camera finds Mara kneeling in the garden. The warm sun and the rich smell of wet earth have brought her true peace. Then comes the sound, the deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. She turns with a radiant smile, expecting Dante's towering silhouette. Instead, every drop of blood violently drains from her face. It is the architect of her nightmares, Gavin. He stands at the edge of the roses, looking entirely unhinged. His clothes hang on his gaunt frame, his hollow eyes vibrate with manic desperation. "Hello, Mara," he says, his voice a sickeningly smooth venom. Her heart slams against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grips the metal trowel, her hands suddenly shaking violently. "How did you find me?" Mara chokes out, the air turning to ash in her lungs. Gavin's lips stretch into a thin, bloodless smile that never reaches his dead eyes. "I have always been very good at tracking what belongs to me." This is the twisted logic of the abuser, convincing the victim that they are entirely inescapable. Mara forces herself to stand, though her trembling knees feel like water. The beautiful garden instantly morphs into a suffocating cage. "You need to leave," she commands, keeping her chin high despite the icy terror in her veins. "I will," he promises softly. "I just need 5 minutes." He takes a painfully slow step forward. She takes one step back. "I just want to talk," he pushes. "We have nothing to talk about." She fires back. His mask instantly slips, his tone turning sharp and ragged. "You left me. You divorced me." In his dangerously warped mind, she has committed the ultimate sin of finally choosing herself. "I owe you nothing," she states, her voice a fragile shield. You owe me everything. The vicious shout cracks like a whip across the yard. Gavin's face violently twists into a hateful snarl, transforming back into the monster she had run from. I gave you everything. I took care of you. I made you into something, and you threw it away. Look closely at his delusion. He truly believes he owns her soul. It is a stark reminder that we cannot reason with a mind built on possession. Mara tightens her grip on the iron trowel until her knuckles turn white. The blood roars in her ears like a freight train. You did not love me, she says quietly, finding a strange courage in the face of her doom. You hurt me. He opens his mouth to lie, but she cuts him off. You broke my wrist. You gave me a concussion. You tore my mind to pieces. Her voice cracks, tears blurring her vision, but she bravely holds her ground against the devil himself. Step into this scene with me, you and I. The garden air has grown heavy, thick with crushed roses and impending tragedy. You told me I deserved it, Mara insists, her voice trembling but refusing to break. Watch the slight twitch near Gavin's eye, a flicker of guilt instantly buried beneath cold annoyance. You are exaggerating, he drawls smoothly. You always do. This is his Christopher Trulick, denying a victim's reality to maintain control. I am not, she replies, standing her ground as he steps closer, casting a dark shadow. You make me a monster, he whispers, playing the martyr, when I only tried to help. Her bitter laugh cracks the silence like dry wood. You put me in a hospital bed. You fell, he lies smoothly. Without a blink, you pushed me. Her fists clench tightly as raw adrenaline floods her veins. We must always remember this vital lesson. Fiercely, holding onto our own truth is the very first step out of the dark. The camera closes in on Gavin, bathed in an unforgiving light. You ran to a criminal, he counters smoothly, a man who will break your mind far worse than I ever could. Mara's breath catches. You do not know him. I know, men like him, Gavin insists. They take what they want and leave you hollow. That is exactly who you are, she replies, her voice cutting the heavy air like a blade. That has always been you. A muscle twitches in Gavin's tight jaw. Come with me, he demands. We can start over. Mara stares, bewildered by his twisted reality. I am trying to save you, he pleads. Her hands shake so violently, she must lock her arms against her sides. This dark portrait reveals a quiet, painful truth. Those who break our wings will always claim they are the only ones who can teach us how to fly. The only delusion I suffered was loving you, she states, her voice ringing like a tragic bell. I am ending this cycle. Get away from me. Watch as Gavin's face shifts. The caring mask melts, exposing the venomous core beneath. You think you are better than me? His voice drops to a hiss. You think a violent man in a tailored suit makes you safe. You will never be free. You belong to me. Suddenly, he lunges. Time slows in the frame. Raw instinct takes over. She swings a heavy iron trowel with all her might, the metal connecting with his cheekbone with a sickening crack. He recoils with a sharp cry, grasping his bloodied face. True survival demands that we shatter what once controlled us, a dark reminder that lasting peace is often bought with a fierce, unyielding defense. Blood slips through Gavin's fingers. Then, the true apex predator emerges. Dante steps into the light without a sound, a terrifying portrait of controlled fury. In a heartbeat, his hand clamps around Gavin's throat, slamming him against the rough stone wall. Do not, Dante whispers, his voice a lethal rumble. Do not move, do not speak. Gavin's eyes widen in sheer terror. Dante's gaze snaps to Mara, scanning her shaking frame. Are you hurt? He demands. Softly, she shakes her head, frozen shock. Dante turns back to the bleeding man, tightening his merciless grip. I gave you clear warnings about coming near her. She is not yours. We find a profound lesson in this violent shadow. True protection never cages a soul. It merely stands as an unyielding shield against the dark. Look closely at this frame with me. She never was your property, Dante finishes. From the shadows, Luca and another armed guard step onto the lawn, pulling Gavin from the wall and forcing him to his knees in the dirt. Call the police, Dante commands. Luca pauses, confusion crossing his scarred face. Boss, are you sure? Call them now. Gavin lets out a broken, hysterical laugh. The police?
You think they will believe her over me?
Dante kneels, bringing his face dangerously close. They will believe her this time, because she has my power behind her. Gavin spits blood into the crushed roses. This is not over. Yes, Dante replies with chilling calm. It is. It teaches us a vital truth. When we finally gather the courage to fight back, life provides the exact allies we need to hold our ground. You did exactly what you had to do, Dante murmurs. It just a steady anchor in the chaos. Mara's breath hitches as the violence crashes down. I hurt him, she whispers. I know, Dante replies gently. I have never. Her voice breaks. He wraps his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, and her rigid posture crumbles into uncontrollable shaking. You are safe now. She buries her face against his dark coat, her fingers clutching the fabric like a lifeline. He crossed the line, she sobs. He tried to touch me, I know, but he was stopped. I told him no, and I fought back. You were incredibly brave, he tells her. I was terrified, she weeps. This moment offers a beautiful life lesson we must all remember. True courage can never exist without the crippling presence of absolute fear. Notice the shift of posture. Luca stands like a stone sentinel in the shadows, keeping watch. Mara turns her eyes back to Gavin, and for the first time, that tragic flinch of a battered soul is gone. I want to file formal charges against him, she states, her voice ringing with newfound iron. Document the years of abuse, the stalking, breaking into my home. Dante squeezes her shoulder gently. Are you sure? He will use his lawyers. He will lie to destroy your name. I do not care at all, Mara replies, the cool breeze catching her hair. He has lost all his power over me. Dante quietly studies her face. The trauma remains, but her fragile spirit has finally turned to steel. It teaches a vital life lesson. Our deepest, most painful scars eventually become the very armor that makes us untouchable. Then we let the law do its work, Dante murmurs. Red and blue lights slash through the garden shadows. 10 minutes later, flashbulbs illuminate the bloody ruin of Gavin's face, capturing the dark bruises on Mara's pale wrists where he had grabbed her. They handcuff him for the break-in, the assault, and the restraining order she had almost forgotten. As officers drag him toward the cruiser, he tries one last move to break her spirit. These charges mean nothing. He spits into the dark. My lawyers will have me out by morning. Mara simply stares back at him, her gaze unflinching. You probably will be, she agrees quietly. But your hold on my mind is broken forever. This scene leaves us with an undeniably powerful lesson. True freedom is not about locking the monster away in a cell. It is about permanently locking him out of your soul. Let us open this chapter together, you and I. We are witnessing the beautiful moment. A heavy chain snaps. Gavin tries to spit one last twisted word, but the heavy door of the cruiser slams shut, cutting off his poison. As the sirens fade into the dark, Mara stands alone among the ruined roses. Her dress is stained with damp soil, her hands painted with his blood. Yet for the first time in 3 agonizing years, she breathes free air. Dante steps closer, reading the fierce storm brewing in her eyes. I am just so angry, she whispers. Good, he replies softly. Let it burn. Anger, after years of feeling small, is the soul's desperate cry of self-worth. We must remember this essential life lesson. Anger is often the sacred fire we desperately need to burn away the lies and finally forge our strongest self. Her voice is a fragile whisper as she grasps the miracle of her survival. Dante gently guides her inside, his touch a steady anchor in the chilling aftermath. In a tragic twist of fate, the man who returned to destroy her mind accidentally handed her the keys to her own power. But the body remembers its terror. Sleep becomes an impossibility. She lies frozen, trapped in a looping nightmare of the garden. The crunch of the metal trowel, the stunned disbelief in Gavin's eyes. By 2 a.m, her racing heart forces her from bed. She wanders down the shadowed hallway, finding Dante in his dim study, pouring whiskey to numb his own unseen demons. This quiet moment teaches a profound life lesson. Healing is never a straight line, and the hardest battles we face are often fought in the lonely hours of the night. The lines of Dante's face soften as she steps into the doorway. He recognizes that haunted stare, the curse of the midnight survivor. They sit together in the quiet, 2 shattered souls finding balance in the dark. Finally, she breaks the silence, trembling as she confesses her lingering terror. Gavin had promised she would always be his, a cruel hook meant to drag her under the waves. Her mind knows it is a lie, but her wounded heart still doubts the sun. Dante leans forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers, demanding her focus. He offers the key to unlock the cage. Freedom, he tells her gently, is never something the captor hands over. It is something you must fiercely take. This frames a profound life lesson. True independence is never a freely given gift. It is always a beautifully hard-won victory. You and I know the hardest part of escaping a storm is learning to walk in the sun. He reminds her of the immense strength she displayed in the garden. Tears spill over her eyelashes, not from sorrow, but from the terrifying weight of sudden freedom. She confesses her dread that the sky is waiting to fall again. Dante reaches out, assuring her the ghosts will fade. When she tries to thank him, to lay her salvation at his feet, he shakes his head, refusing to let her trade one master for another. I only gave you a quiet room, he whispers. The healing was all you. The path forward is terrifyingly simple now. Let the law handle the monster and dare to breathe again. The beautiful life lesson here is that surviving the dark is only the first step. The greatest bravery is learning to live in the light. Her rage hardens into cold obsidian. She demands a reckoning, not just for the physical bruises, but for the systematic murder of her soul. Dante stands quietly in the shadows, offering a faint, validating smile. She moves toward him, and their kiss is fierce, a desperate biological collision born from the terror of isolation. Pulling away, her breathing is jagged in the silent room. She whispers her thanks, not for his physical shield, but for truly seeing the fierce woman hidden beneath the broken victim. Dante gently frames her face in his calloused hands. The violent trembling in her shoulders finally stops. This scene offers a simple, profound life lesson. We cannot heal in complete darkness. We need another human being to witness our pain before we can finally begin to walk away from it. Across the city, bathed in the sickly fluorescent glow of a concrete holding cell, the abuser sits in absolute, terrifying stillness. A broken mind like his cannot comprehend defeat, only a bleeding wound to his fragile ego. Denied his chosen victim, his twisted pathology demands the complete destruction of the man who stole her. 36 hours later, the cage is empty. We cut to Dante at 7 a.m, watching Mara force down a dry piece of toast. When his phone vibrates violently against the mahogany table, the harsh sound makes her flinch. Dante steps into the freezing hallway. Luca is on the line, his voice wound tight. The worst-case scenario is reality. Escaping a monster is only the very first agonizing step of survival. The hardest part is staying free. You and I know that a $2 million bail is nothing but fragile paper against a tyrant armed with endless resources. Dante grips his phone, the thick leather of his shoulder holster creaking under the sudden violent tension. The target walked out 20 minutes ago, wearing the arrogant smirk of absolute impunity. Then comes the crushing blow. They lost the surveillance feed. Dante demands Luca repeat the words. The ghost slipped out a secondary exit and simply vanished into the sprawling concrete labyrinth. Dante closes his eyes. He forces a slow, 5-second breath into his burning lungs to cage his rising panic. His voice drops to a lethal whisper, ordering his men to tear the city apart. A cornered predator is dangerous, but panic breeds sloppiness. Desperate men always make the fatal mistakes that lead to their ruin. The sprawling estate instantly transforms into an impenetrable fortress. Dante doubles the heavy perimeter guard, plunging the lush grounds into a brutal state of martial law, and locks down Serafina to sever any possible leverage. Standing in his shadowed office, he ruthlessly calculates every catastrophic angle. Then a soft sound breaks his iron focus. Mara stands in the doorway, her slender arms wrapped tightly around her own fragile ribs. Despite her defensive posture, her eyes are terrifyingly clear. She reads the raw violence etched into his shoulders. Dante does not dare lie to her. He hands over the cold, brutal facts. She asks only for the next step. Dante steps close, his voice a low, sacred vow. He promises to slaughter the threat before it ever touches her shadow. True protection often requires walking in the absolute darkest of places. You and I need to look closely at what happens next, because the tragedy deepens right here. A hollow, broken laugh slips from her trembling lips. It is the haunting sound of a woman who knows the monster intimately. She understands that a tyrant stripped of his kingdom no longer cares about his own survival. He will gladly burn the world to the ground, just to watch her turn to ash within it. Dante grabs her shoulders, trying to anchor her to the present, swearing his stone walls will hold, but she stares right through him, pointing out that human vigilance cannot last forever. Though defeated by her devastating logic, Dante pulls her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. 2 agonizing days drag by in total silence. The predator has melted into the dark, leaving nothing but suffocating paranoia in his wake. The crushing silence is a terrible weapon all its own. Mara tries to weave a fragile illusion of normalcy, tending to her garden and offering polite smiles to the heavily armed guards. But the camera catches the agonizing truth bleeding through her facade. A single falling leaf makes her gasp for air. Her fearful eyes constantly dart toward the thick shadows of the doorways. By the 3rd night, her fractured mind simply refuses to sleep. Dante finds her in the pitch-black study, her pale fingers wrapped in a death grip around a glass of untouched wine. When he whispers her name, the emotional dam finally breaks. She confesses the truest, ugliest reality of survival. The worst part is not the violence itself, but the breathless, sickening wait for the shadow to return. The deepest scars are always left by the sheer terror of anticipation. She leans her forehead against the freezing glass of the window, exhausted down to the very marrow of her bones. The gilded cage Dante built to keep her safe is exactly like the suffocating prison she'd just escaped. Watching her silhouette drown against the sprawling city lights, Dante fights a desperate, clawing urge to lie. He wants to wrap her in sweet promises and tell her the agonizing nightmare is over. But love built on deception is just another cruel form of abuse. He swallows his fierce pride and offers her the ugliest truth. He does not know where the monster is hiding, and he is terrified. She sets the heavy crystal glass down on the mahogany desk. The truth is always a bitter medicine to swallow. You realize that true safety sometimes requires us to surrender the very freedom we fought so fiercely to win. For years, she believed a deeply tragic lie. She genuinely thought if she was just quiet enough, just perfect enough, she could somehow control the beast. Standing in the heavy dark, she finally shatters that illusion aloud. His twisted cruelty was never about her flaws. It was entirely about his insatiable, sick hunger to break a beautiful human spirit. Slowly, her tear-stained face hardens into a magnificent mask of pure defiance. She completely refuses to spend another precious second cowering in the shadows. She wants to take the brutal fight straight to him. Dante silently watches the terrifying transformation in her posture. This is no longer blind panic. This is a cold, calculated hunger for war. He steps slowly across the Persian rug, preparing to navigate this wild new fire. Absolute despair always transforms into sheer courage in the end. She fiercely demands a seat at the war table, entirely refusing to remain a passive pawn in her own rescue. Dante studies her pale face, beautifully bathed in the cold moonlight spilling through the glass. He sees her incredible, rising strength, the painstaking way she has stitched her shattered soul back together. But a strong spirit cannot stop a flying bullet. He validates her bravery, his voice a low, trembling rumble. But he draws a firm line in the sand. He will not gamble with her heartbeat. Mara, her steps closer, her jaw set like stone. She delivers a devastatingly logical blow. She tells him that locking her away in a sterile bubble is just a slower, quieter way of killing her. The lesson here is painful but necessary. We cannot shelter someone so intensely that we accidentally smother the very spark of life we are trying so desperately to protect. We have to recognize a hard truth together. Healing is never a clean, straight line. Just as quickly as it came, the fierce defiance drains from her rigid posture, and she collapses heavily against Dante's chest. She confesses a terrifying fear that she is slowly losing her fragile grip on reality. The endless waiting is eroding her mind. Dante wraps his arms around her tightly, becoming the solid physical anchor she so desperately needs. When she whispers that the monster might actually win, he speaks right against her temple. He has studied the darkest minds in the world, and her quiet resilience outshines every single one of them. A wet, genuine laugh finally escapes her trembling lips. But the fragile is brutally shattered at 2:37 in the morning. The black phone on the mahogany desk erupts into a violent, angry vibration. The sudden, incredibly sharp vibration of the phone slices right through the heavy dark, instantly shattering their exhausted sleep. For a dangerous man wired like Dante, there is no groggy awakening. The biological shift is violent and absolute, pure fight or flight. Luca is on the line, delivering the sickening shockwave. The tyrant, Gavin, has just stumbled into a local hospital after deliberately swallowing a lethal cocktail of pills and alcohol. A classic, purely manipulative cry for attention. They pumped the poison from his stomach, and his very first breath was used to demand Mara. Dante feels his blood run cold, replaced instantly by a primal, terrifying, territorial rage. He barks a ruthless command. He will not let the twisted pathogen near her. It is terrifying how easily deep love can make a ruthless monster out of any decent man. Here is where the cold, rigid machinery of justice so often fails us. The authorities desperately need a neat, perfectly recorded confession from Gavin to lock him away, and they want to use Mara as the bait. Dante completely refuses to serve her up, but the heavy air suddenly shifts in the hallway. Luca falls dead silent on the phone as Dante turns to see Mara standing in the doorframe, her face entirely devoid of color. The nightmare has woken her again. He delivers the grim medical update without a single trace of emotion. She does not cry, she only asks, with a chilling emptiness, if the monster is finally dead. When Dante gently says no, he immediately slips into the harsh role of the dictator, ordering her to stay hidden. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The primal, desperate need to protect looks exactly like control. The camera lingers on Mara as she completely ignores the sharp commands thrown her way, shattering any illusion that she can still be controlled. She grabs the phone from his grip, her voice dropping to a calm register as she tells Luca she will arrive in exactly 60 minutes. Beside her, Dante shifts in the dim light, his broad shoulders tensing. He warns her that a predator like Gavin feels no guilt, only an endless hunger for the cracks in your soul. Dante knows the dark architecture of a narcissist because he walks those same shadowed halls. But Mara refuses to back down. She chooses to walk straight into the jaws of the trap to stop the humiliating circus of a public trial. Sometimes, the only way to escape the shadow of a monster is to look it directly in the eye, because running away only prolongs the nightmare. The cinematic lens focuses tightly on her desperate, burning need to see him absolutely ruined. Mara has to witness the physical decay of the man who broke her, needing to strip away the false power he held over her mind to finally break the trauma bond. She must see him as weak, rewriting her tragic history. In the dark, Dante violently grips the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitches. His overwhelming urge to end Gavin's life pulses heavily through the car. Yet, watching the cold fixation in her unblinking eyes, Dante realizes that holding her back now would destroy their trust. He reluctantly yields, but sets one unbreakable rule. One wrong move, and he pulls her out. You and I both know all too well that to truly heal, we often have to willingly stand in the roaring fire ourselves to sever the toxic ties that bind us. The camera pans up to St. Michael's Hospital, a brutal concrete fortress cutting into the pitch-black sky. The harsh bleed of red and blue sirens washes over the parking lot as Dante kills the engine. He turns, offering her one final out, but her jaw is set like carved marble. Beside him, Mara's hands tremble violently in her lap, yet there is no going back. They navigate the blinding, suffocating white of the corridors until Detective Brennan intercepts them with a practiced, sympathetic smile. But hollow comfort is useless here. Empty words do nothing to bandage a soul that has been ripped open. Mara doesn't want pity today. She needs the terrifying, sterile cold of this battleground to forge her own emotional armor. Sometimes, the only way to heal a deep wound is to march straight into the dark and face the demon waiting on the other side of the glass. Mara offers a sharp, silent nod, and the heavy quiet of the third floor swallows them whole. Through the thick security glass, the room is bathed in a sickly, fluorescent green. Gavin is tethered to the bed, tube snaking across his pale skin. He looks pathetic, like a dying animal. But the second his dark eyes lock onto Mara, the frail act drops. Replaced by the ravenous hunger of a predator, evil never truly dies. It just waits in the dark for a fresh opening. Detective Brennan steps forward, physically blocking Dante's path. The lens catches a flash of absolute, murderous fury in his eyes. Men like Dante simply cannot bear to be cut out of the frame when the woman they love steps into a cage with a monster. Yet, The hardest battles of the spirit must always be fought alone. Mara rests her small hand against Dante's rigid chest. It is a silent plea that instantly grounds the violent storm raging in his eyes. He stares down at her, his jaw ticking, and grants her exactly 10 minutes, 600 agonizing seconds before he rips that door off its hinges. Taking one deep, shuddering breath to quiet her heart, Mara pushes forward. The heavy door seals behind her with a suffocating click. The room is thick with the sharp stench of bleach and slow rot. On the mattress, the architect of her nightmare turns his gaunt face. Lean in and watch closely, because you and I are about to witness a human's spirit pushed to the absolute brink. True courage is never the absence of terror. It is feeling your whole body shake and choosing to walk into the dark room anyway. When Gavin speaks, his voice is a broken rasp, yet the toxic venom drips just the same. He begs her to step closer, a desperate attempt to drag her back into his web. Mara plants her feet by the door, staying safely out of reach. His face twists as he tries to shame her, mocking the fear he assumes is paralyzing her. When his cruelty fails, the tears fall, delivering a hollow, rehearsed apology. Instead of a sob, a sharp, broken laugh escapes Mara's lips, echoing off the cold tiles. Panicking, he shifts blame, weaponizing his own depression as an excuse for years of torment. We must never forget this. When a manipulator hands you a tearful apology, it is rarely a sign of genuine remorse. It is just a disguised hook, waiting patiently to pull you right back under the dark water. Mara refuses the bait, her eyes narrowing as she strips away his pathetic disguise. She leans forward, letting him hear the absolute disgust in her voice. She knows his overdose was never a tragic cry for help. It was a cheap theatrical stunt to dodge a prison cell. With chilling precision, she tears down his remaining walls, telling him the cold sweat on his brow is just the shock of facing real consequences. His silver tongue is useless here. The lens pushes in tight on his violently trembling hands. When those who thrive on controlling others finally lose their grip, they do not feel remorse for the lives they shattered. They only feel the terrifying void of their own weakness. Ultimately, the unvarnished truth will always be the sharpest weapon we can wield. The room crackles with tension as Mara cuts him open with her words. She watches him desperately try to pluck the old strings of her trauma to make her drop the charges. As his crumbles to dust, genuine panic flashes across his sickly features. He violently snarls, demanding to know why she even came. Anchoring her hands to the freezing metal of the bed rail, she delivers the fatal blow. She tells him she simply needed to look at the towering monster of her nightmares and see him for what he truly is, a fragile, broken man trying to steal life from stronger people. His sunken face flushes a furious crimson. We must remember that once we drag our deepest demons out into the harsh daylight, they completely lose their power to haunt us in the dark. Cornered and stripped of his power, the narcissist lashes out with raw venom. He mocks her bond with Dante, trying to poison her safety. He then delivers his cruelest blow, whispering that she deserved the abuse because she was too weak to stop it. It is a sickening betrayal, blaming the victim for freezing while the predator bites. The camera holds tight on Mara's face, bracing for the familiar crumble of tears, but the tears never fall. Instead, a blinding resilience ignites in her eyes. She refuses to carry his shame for another second. Before her mind even processes the movement, her hand flies through the air, striking him hard across the jaw. In moments of profound survival, the physical body will violently demand the justice that the waking mind was long denied. The crack of the slap echoes through the sterile room like a gunshot, A thin line of crimson blood slowly pools at the corner of Gavin's split lip. His eyes turn feral, but it no longer matters. Mara has ascended to a fortress he can never breach again. Looking down at his broken frame, she declares that he will never dictate her worth again. Turning her back on the bed, she looks directly at Detective Brennan. Her voice is pure iron. She demands every single charge be filed immediately. Assault, stalking, a permanent wall between her and the ghost of her past. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? True liberation rarely arrives wrapped in a neat, peaceful bow. It almost always requires a messy, violent severing of the rusted chains that have held us down for far too long. Mara pushes through the glass doors without looking back, leaving the remains of her trauma behind. He stole 3 years of her life, but he will not get a single second of her future. As she steps into the dim hallway, Dante is waiting. His dark eyes scan her pale face, demanding to know what happened in that cage. Her chest heaves as she confesses to striking the monster. Dante's lips curl into a grim, satisfied smile, instantly validating her violence. She whispers how the abuser tried to make the nightmares her fault. Healing is never a clean break. Looking up at Dante, the tears finally spill over as she confesses a terrifying truth. She wants Gavin to suffer exactly as she did. A shattered heart does not merely long for peace. It often hungers for a dark, unforgiving justice. Dante reaches out, catching a tear from her cheek. He explains that walking away is the ultimate blade to a narcissist's throat. A monster simply cannot survive being ignored. A ragged sound tears from Mara's chest, caught between a laugh and a sob. She expected closure, but her veins are pumping with white-hot fury. Dante leans in close, telling her that anger is a profound gift. It is the exact opposite of being a victim. With chilling sincerity, he promises that if the law fails, he will finish the job himself. They turn to leave, but the camera snaps focus as a sudden vibration shatters the quiet. Luca's screen lights up with a frantic message from Serafina. Life is ruthless. Just as one violent storm breaks, the dark clouds of another gather. Stick with me. This is where the tension becomes unbearable. Watch the exact frame where a man's soul fractures. The camera pushes in on Dante as the phone line drops into a terrifying silence. The street noise fades. A voice bleeds through the tiny speaker. It is not Serafina. It is Gavin. His flat tone, completely devoid of human warmth, strikes Dante like a physical blow. The blood drains from his face. Relax, Gavin whispers, his voice dripping with calculated cruelty. Your grandmother is still breathing. A muffled, defiant cry from the old matriarch echoes through the line before being abruptly choked off. The terms are carved in ice. Dante has exactly 2 hours to bring Mara, completely alone, to the rotting textile mill on River Street. 2 hours to trade one life for another. Do not involve the police, or I will make her suffer, Gavin breathes. 2 hours. The line clicks dead. The camera holds on Dante, frozen beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp. Inside, his mind is violently tearing itself apart. Mara stands inches away, her face pale as porcelain, her eyes silently begging him to explain what happened. Dante stares back at her, absorbing the sadistic genius of Gavin's trap. This is a brutal Greek tragedy forced into modern flesh. Dante must weigh the life of the fierce matriarch who raised him against the woman who holds his heart. The deepest human agony does not stem from physical pain. It is born from the impossible, soul-crushing choices that love eventually demands of us. He stands there, completely drowning in the suffocating silence. The camera opens on a world blind to their tragedy. A flickering neon sign bleeds harsh light across Dante's face. Far off, a siren wails. a cruel reminder of salvation they cannot call. Mara reaches out, her trembling fingertips brushing his rigid arm. Dante refuses to look at her, terrified her panic will break him. When he speaks, his voice is a hollow drum. Gavin is out. He has Sarafina at the facility. He wants you. Watch the exact frame where the air leaves Mara's lungs. Knowing the horrific violence waiting for the matriarch, the color drains from her skin. She turns into a statue of flawless, paralyzed marble. It reminds us that true devastation does not announce itself with thunder, but arrives in the quietest, most suffocating whispers. Let you and I watch closely as trauma wraps its cold hands around the innocent. Mara presses Hesse to her mouth, eyes wide with horrific realization. She desperately tries to drag the blame onto her own shoulders, convinced her existence birthed this nightmare. Dante shatters that illusion. His voice breaks as he seizes her trembling shoulders, swearing Gavin is a clinical monster, not her fault. Mara quivers violently, begging for a way out. Dante's eyes dart through the shadows, calculating impossible angles. Calling his men or the authorities is an instant death sentence for his grandmother. Gavin's paranoia is a hairpin trigger. Sometimes, the most brutal lesson life teaches is that, to save what we love, we must walk willingly into the absolute dark. The camera pushes in as they stand at the edge of the abyss. Dante knows the stench of death hangs over this encounter, yet his voice drops into a resonant rumble. He swears he will bring Sarafina home. That vow anchors Mara's panic, but the shame of being used as human currency rots her from the inside. Tears spilling down her cheeks, she begs Dante to trade her life for the matriarch. In a beautifully tragic cinematic beat, Dante frames her pale face in his shaking hands. He forces her to look into the raw desperation of his eyes, fiercely rejecting her plea. He will never put their souls on a scale. True devotion, we learn here, is never measured in moments of peace. It is forged only in the terrifying roaring fires of absolute sacrifice. The audio tracks Mara's jagged breathing as it synchronizes with Dante's iron resolve. He pulls his phone, summoning Luca into the nightmare. In venomous whispers, Dante issues the decree. Gavin has the matriarch. He commands his shadow army to descend upon River Street like invisible phantoms. No flashing lights, zero sirens. When Luca asks for the rules of engagement, Dante's eyes go entirely dead. Deploy maximum lethal capacity. His voice rings colder than a grave. The drive is a masterpiece of suffocating tension, scored only by the haunting hum of tires on rain-soaked asphalt. We must remember that absolute rage is a quiet passenger. Mara twists her fingers until the knuckles gleam bone white, while Dante stares into the void, calculating a dozen violent outcomes. The coordinates pull them deep into the city's rotting underbelly, where the industrial district looms like a graveyard of rusted iron. It is the ultimate stage for a monster who craves both darkness and theatrical cruelty. Dante cuts the headlights, letting the heavy sedan glide blind behind a decayed shipping container. The ambient sound drops to a terrifying hush. Before stepping out, he turns to Mara, drawing a harsh boundary. She must stay in his shadow. No heroics, not a single breath of sound. He paints a terrifying portrait of the fractured mind waiting in the dark. Gavin's psyche has entirely collapsed. Life teaches us that when a human mind loses all tether to logic, the capacity for monstrous violence becomes boundless. There is no predicting what a shattered man will do. You and I must recognize the terrifying danger of a man with nothing left to lose. Dante understands a cornered predator is exponentially more lethal. He demands Mara's absolute obedience. But in a breathtaking act of defiance, she fires back, Begging him not to throw his life away to save hers, the camera pushes in close on Dante's conflicted face. Shadows catch the anguish in his eyes. He cannot make that promise. His very biology is screaming to protect her. They lock into an intense, low-light stare, breathing the same heavy air. It is a vital lesson in human connection. Sometimes love is not a gentle romance, but a ferocious instinct willing to step in front of a bullet. With a broken sob, Dante pulls her into a desperate embrace, holding her like the world is ending. When they finally pull apart, Dante's voice is ragged and raw. He lays out a grim emergency protocol. If the darkness swallows them, she must run. She must suppress every urge to save him. Tears spill hot over Mara's eyelashes, but she shakes her head. Let us honor this magnificent pivot. For years, her only instinct was to run from her abuser. Now, she rejects the escape route, firmly anchoring her soul to Dante's. She insists they step into the fire together, accepting the ultimate tragic binary. They survive, or they die. The camera shows Dante fighting the urge to lock her safely in the car. Yet, true love demands we respect the freedom of those we cherish, even when it terrifies us. He slowly nods, his jaw tight with dread. They will walk into the abyss as one. The moment the doors click shut, they are utterly exposed. The derelict facility looms against the night sky, a jagged metaphor for Gavin's rotting mind. The main gates are chained tight, forcing Dante toward a rusted side entrance. The scent of cut metal hangs heavy in the damp air. The camera catches the cold slide of Dante's firearm as he checks the chamber by pure tactile instinct. Behind his broad shoulders, Mara vibrates with sheer terror. Her breath is sharp, her frame shaking violently. He whispers a command to stay impossibly close. But the inside is an absolute auditory nightmare. The floor is an ocean of shattered glass, a literal graveyard. It teaches us how life's hardest paths are never quiet. Every single agonizing step they take in the dark risks an echoing betrayal. Dante's eyes adjust to the suffocating gloom. He stalks forward, every nerve singing with hypervigilance. Without warning, a sharp voice tears through the silence. It is the matriarch. Even as a hostage, she projects absolute dominance, promising her captor her grandson's wrath will burn him to ash. Hearing Serafina's unwavering voice releases the crushing pressure in Dante's chest. She is waging brilliant psychological warfare. Let us take her profound lesson to heart. True strength does not negotiate with monsters, it defies them to the end. Using her echoing voice as a morbid lighthouse, Dante and Mara creep through the decaying machinery. They step into a cavernous room, finding Gavin bathed in the sickly light of a single, swinging industrial bulb. Let you and I step into this suffocating space together. The camera pans slowly across Gavin. He is a crumbling, tragic monument to his own madness. His skin is a translucent gray, shining with the cold sweat of a tyrant whose empire has fallen. His wrist twitches violently, the heavy gun shaking wildly as he aims it at Serafina. She is strapped to a rusted chair, wrists bleeding, yet sits with the posture of an unbothered queen. As Dante bursts through the doorway, a microscopic flicker of relief softens her ancient eyes. We learn here that true dignity is something no rope can ever bind. Gavin spins around, feral and manic, snapping his weapon toward the noise. Without hesitation, Dante shields Mara with his massive frame, leveling his own gun dead at Gavin's chest. A jagged laugh rips from Gavin's throat. It is the chilling sound of a human mind finally shattering. Clinging to the ghost of his power, he screams a pathetic lie, swearing his men have the building surrounded. He offers Dante a twisted ultimatum of death or submission. Dante's gaze is devoid of fear, calling the bluff effortlessly. The reality breaks Gavin's illusion, his sweaty finger trembling violently against the trigger. Panicking, he demands Mara, begging for a phantom of ownership. Dante rejects the trade with a stone-cold stare. In response, Gavin jams the barrel directly at Serafina's head. The matriarch simply laughs, mocking his trembling hands. Life teaches us that cowards crumble before absolute courage. Serafina reminds the room she has survived real wars, and a pathetic boy will never end her story. The tension finally snaps. Gavin's impulse control evaporates. He pulls the trigger. A deafening roar tears through the concrete room. The bullet shatters the wall 6 inches from Serafina's head, raining white plaster dust over her like snow. Look closely at the matriarch. She is a terrifying masterclass in psychological dominance. Not a single muscle in her weathered face twitches. She stares at the man who just tried to murder her, eyes burning with regal contempt, and coldly whispers that he missed. Beside Dante, Mara is unraveling, clawing at his jacket. Yet Dante remains an unmoving statue. Life's hardest moments demand we become stone to protect the fragile. Gavin violently racks his weapon, screaming his final manic delusion into the shadows. The camera pushes in close on Gavin, bathed in harsh, unforgiving shadows. This is where the unvarnished tragedy of the human ego is laid perfectly bare. His voice hits an agonizing pitch, the breathless cry of a cornered tyrant violently refusing his own reflection. He aims the barrel at the old woman, but spits his venom entirely at Mara, screaming that her betrayal incinerated his career and his entire universe. In the twisted theater of his mind, he is the victim. But watch the frame shift to Mara. Something magnificent happens. The invisible chains of her trauma bond simply drop to the concrete. Her voice rings out, hauntingly steady. She didn't run into Dante's arms. She fled the suffocating cage Gavin built. There is a profound truth we must remember here. True healing only sparks the second a wounded soul refuses to carry the dark sins of their abuser. The megalomaniac simply cannot comprehend his own guilt. The camera tracks the violent shaking of Gavin's hands, the heavy metal of the gun dipping as he sobs a broken confession of love. You and I know how easily monsters confuse love with ownership, don't we? But Mara sees the illusion. With a spine of absolute steel, she declares she will never be his property again. Then, burying every natural instinct to survive, she steps out from Dante's shadow, walking straight into the line of fire. The lens captures Dante's absolute terror. A sickening rush of panic floods his rigid frame as he watches her approach a loaded weapon. Mara stops exactly 10 feet away. It is a deliberate, terrifying boundary line drawn in the dust, forcing the madman to stare directly into the ruins of his kingdom. 10 feet. The framing highlights the space between them as an agonizing gorge. At this proximity, if Gavin's trembling finger twitches against the trigger, Dante's lethal reflexes will be a fraction of a second too slow. Mara is executing a heart-stopping trade, offering her fragile freedom to buy Serafina's breath. Dante's voice shatters the tense air, a desperate, raspy plea begging her to stop. But Mara's focus holds sharp on the monster, softly promising him absolute obedience. A storm of paranoia flashes across Gavin's ruined face, wrestling with his pathetic need to be worshipped. He demands to know if she is playing him. Mara's eyes remain deep, sorrowful pools, reminding him she never lies. Sometimes true sacrifice demands we walk back into the flames. Gavin's jaw grinds tight, his obsessive, manic gaze locking entirely on her. The raw, pitiful fragility of the villain is laid bare. When his voice cracks in the heavy, dust-filled air, he needs spoken confirmation that his songbird is returning to the cage. Watch how Mara's face turns to stone, building a brilliant shield of dissociation to survive the nightmare. She feeds him a masterfully woven half-truth, stating calmly she will do whatever it takes to protect innocent blood. For a starving tyrant, even a crumb of surrender feels like a feast. Gavin slowly lowers the barrel, demanding she bridge the final gap. Before she moves, the camera lingers as Mara turns her head. She holds Dante's gaze in a devastating silence, pouring 1,000 unspoken apologies into his shattered soul. She is silently washing the guilt from his hands. It teaches us that the deepest love is often found in the quietest, most heartbreaking sacrifices. The emotional dam finally breaks, and hot tears catch the dim light as they spill down Mastra's cheeks. She whispers her truth into the shadows, stepping perfectly into her tragic role as the savior of Dante's bloodline. Across the brutal concrete room, Dante is shivering, his massive frame trembling with the agonizing weight of utter helplessness. His weapon is perfectly aligned, but the grim mathematics are a waking nightmare. If he fires without a perfect kill, Gavin's dying reflex will send a bullet straight through Serafina. Stick with me here, because we must recognize that the restraint this requires of a fierce protector is enough to shatter a man's mind. Mara takes the final step. Gavin violently rips her against his chest, shoving the cold steel right against her temple. Dante's world shrinks to a pinprick, swallowed entirely by a blinding, suffocating despair. There is a sickening ecstasy that floods a narcissist when they finally bring a titan to his knees. The lighting feels oppressive as Gavin's drinks in his ultimate victory, screaming at Dante to drop the gun. Serafina's sharp voice cuts through the tension like a whip, ordering her grandson to shoot, knowing all too well that broken men like this never leave survivors. But Gavin viciously twists his arm, sending a visible shockwave of pain crashing through Mara's frame. Dante breaks. He slowly lowers his hand, proving that fierce love will always cast aside cold logic to save the innocent. The heavy weapon slides across the rough floor, vanishing into the shadows. A grotesque smile stretches across Gavin's face as he whispers his bloody conditions. Sometimes total surrender is the bravest act a soul can muster. Dante breathes his quiet, hollow compliance. Notice how completely, unnervingly still Mara becomes in his iron grip. Her total submission is a brilliant, quiet poison engineered to sedate the monster's raging paranoia. She keeps her tear-filled eyes locked on Dante, binding him to a silent, agonizing oath of inaction. But let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Fate always favors the chaotic. In a breathtaking flash of sacrifice, Serafina violently throws her bound body against the hard floor. For just one microscopic fraction of a second, Gavin's manic eyes dart away. In that singular beat, the trauma bond shatters into dust. Mara twists hard, driving her elbow deeply into Gavin's ribs with the force of a lifetime of repressed rage. She shoves the barrel upward just as the gun explodes. The deafening shot shreds the silence, and Dante instantly becomes a beast of war, crushing Gavin into the wall. The weapon clatters uselessly into the cold darkness. Stripped of his metal teeth, Gavin's eyes bulge with raw, unadulterated terror. He is reduced to nothing but a weak man gasping for oxygen as Dante's massive hands lock like iron around his throat. Dante is drowning in a terrifying homicidal rage, his shattered heart demanding the absolute destruction of the architect behind this nightmare. It is a frightening truth we all must face. Sometimes human nature tricks us into believing that inflicting horrific violence is the only way to heal our deepest pain. But then, Mara's gentle voice slices through the red mist. She begs Dante to let go, pleading with him not to become the very demon they fought to escape. The iron grip slowly loosens. Gavin crumbles to the floor just as the blinding lights of heavily armed rescue teams finally pierce the suffocating gloom. Picture this cinematic frame. The camera slowly pans across the shattered concrete, settling on a surreal, tragic tableau. Gavin lies utterly broken, while Mara stands over him. An impenetrable fortress. Sarafina brilliantly breaks the heavy tension, muttering a dark joke about her tight cuffs. A desperate human attempt to outrun the crashing wave of adrenaline. Gavin drowns in the cold sweat of his defeat, yet the wretched man refuses to fade quietly into the shadows. He throws one final verbal hook, desperately trying to claw his way back into Mara's mind. She merely stares back, completely devoid of fear, quietly sealing his ultimate fate. Panicking, Gavin weaponizes Dante's violent past, hoping to poison her new sanctuary. It is a harsh truth of life we cannot ignore. A cornered abuser will always try to burn the world down when they can no longer own it. The lens shifts smoothly to Dante. Gavin tries to paint him as just another monster, a dark mirror of his own twisted soul. But Dante's eyes reveal a tragic, profound self-awareness that true abusers entirely lack. Stepping into the harsh spotlight, Dante surgically dissects the difference between them. He lives by a brutal sacrificial code, fully willing to burn himself alive to keep Mara breathing, while Gavin would gladly kill her just to keep his prize on a shelf. The raw, heavy truth leaves Gavin completely speechless. As the armed men drag him away, his face contorts into a chaotic mask of shattered delusion. He screams out that he loves her. Mara's steady denial echoes off the damp concrete, breaking his final lie. True love is never about violent ownership, a profound lesson that finally leaves the grim factory in absolute, hollow silence. With the predator finally dragged away, the suffocating tension shatters like glass. The massive neurochemical flood begins to drain from the room. Dante immediately checks on Sarafina, who stubbornly complains about her ruined morning routine to hide her shaking hands. Seeing the crushing guilt resting on Dante's wide shoulders, she sharply cuts him off, placing the blame entirely on Gavin. She turns to Mara, praising the girl's fierce will to survive. When Mara weakly attempts a grim smile, Sarafina pulls the exhausted young woman into a deep, violently protective embrace. Stripped of the terrifying need to be strong, Mara's defensive walls completely collapse. Her heavy weeping fills the quiet space. We must recognize this human reality. True healing cannot begin in the rigid armor of survival. It only starts the exact moment we feel safe enough to finally fall apart. The camera drifts back to Dante, capturing the violent tremors in his hands. His body is a silent war zone of lingering rage and profound relief. Hearing the sirens approach, Dante makes a shocking choice: total, unresisting cooperation with the law. For a feared underworld king, bowing to the police is a massive sacrifice, executed entirely to build a stable world for Mara. As his grandmother steps away, Dante closes the gap. Mara looks shattered, but her eyes are finally clear of the abuser's toxic haze. She tries to whisper a broken apology, but he pulls her firmly against his chest, entirely silencing the misplaced guilt. He fiercely demands she recognize her monumental courage. Remember this truth as the scene fades to black. The greatest act of love is often forcing someone to look in the mirror and finally acknowledge their own undeniable strength. Dante pulls her into his chest, the heavy wool of his coat absorbing her violent tremors. He anchors her there in the shadows, letting the absolute reality of her survival sink into her fractured mind. Her voice breaks the quiet, barely louder than a breath, asking if the terror is finally over. His dark eyes scan the street, calculating every moving piece, the witnesses, the felony charges. He swears her tormentor is finished forever. But Mara stays entirely rigid in his arms. The body always remembers the war, even when the guns stop firing. He traces the frantic, hunted ghost in her gaze. He does not lie to her about easy miracles, knowing healing is a grueling climb out of the dark. The truest form of love is not fixing someone. It is simply standing with them in the ruins, refusing to leave. Flashing red and blue sirens bleed through the window, painting stark shadows across the room. Mara turns to the older woman, her voice thick with agonizing guilt for bringing the devil to her door. Sarafina just waves a weathered hand, her dry wit cutting straight through the panic. She brags about her own quick reflexes, treating a lethal invasion like a spilled cup of coffee. It is a masterful redirection. Sometimes a sudden laugh in the pitch black is the only way to shock the heart back into rhythm. Later, under the harsh glare of the detective's flashlight, Mara goes completely numb. She details the gun and the blood with the flat, empty voice of a ghost. Survival is never a beautiful poem. It is a cold, mechanical reflex that shuts down our feelings just long enough to keep us breathing. Let us walk this final stretch of road together. Dante grips the steering wheel, running entirely on a white-hot need to lock the woman he loves safely away from a bleeding world. The engine idles low outside his fortified estate. The camera pushes in on Mara in the passenger seat. She is entirely paralyzed. To an outsider, that glowing porch light means safety. But to a mind conditioned by terror, sudden silence is the most terrifying sound of all. She stares at the heavy oak door, her breathing shallow, dreading her own collapse. You can fight through absolute hell, but peace is often what finally breaks you. Walking into that quiet house means the war is actually over. The heavy armor has to drop, and all the agonizing pain you ignored to survive will finally demand to be felt. The lens pushes close on her trembling hands. Trauma plays a cruel trick, convincing victims their soul is permanently ruined. Mara whispers her darkest fear, terrified she will never find the girl she used to be. Dante does not offer empty platitudes. His large hand engulfs hers, giving her spiraling mind a physical anchor. His voice drops low and steady, reshaping her reality. He tells her she's not broken, just utterly exhausted from surviving a monster. True healing never actually requires you to be strong or unbreakable. It only requires you to find a safe place to put down your sword and rest. Grounded by that simple truth, Mara leans across the dark console and kisses him, fiercely taking back the power she thought she lost forever. Stick with me as we watch these fractured people collide. What looks like a pure romance is often just a desperate trauma bond painted in the colors of love. When Mara whispers her devotion, the camera catches the sharp tightening of Dante's jaw. He is a man ruled by a possessive hunger. His voice turns rough as he confesses that his absolute need for her terrifies him. Revealing the deep cracks in his iron armor, Mara weeps, feeling safe in the arms of a man built for violence. It is a tragic irony. Sometimes, the only shelter from a monster is a more dangerous predator. Suddenly, Sarafina groans, loudly demanding a soft bed and hot coffee. It is a beautifully human moment, using simple annoyance to mask the brutal adrenaline crash they are all silently dreading. Heavy iron gates grind shut, sealing them inside the concrete compound. The camera pans with Mara's exhausted gaze as she studies the high walls and deep shadows, whispering that she is home. Calling a fortress a sanctuary is a heartbreaking milestone in any survivor's journey. She tilts her head to Dante, her eyes shining with fragile hope, thanking him for fighting for her. It is a haunting visual. The broken bird thanking the apex predator for keeping his claws hidden. Dante pulls her tightly against his chest, swearing to protect her, feeding the dark savior complex burning in his blood. We often confuse absolute control for safety when we are desperate. They stand locked together in the dim light, entirely unaware that the sheer violence of tonight has permanently rewritten both of their souls. The human mind has a staggering ability to manufacture optimism while standing at the edge of the abyss. For the first time, Mara actually believes in a future. She stands under the scalding shower, trying to physically scrub away the invisible grease of trauma. It is a desperate ritual we all perform, even knowing water cannot wash away the ghosts in our heads. Stepping into the bedroom, the illusion breaks. The seemingly indestructible Dante sits on the edge of the mattress, his head buried in his hands, paralyzed by a violent flashback. His voice cracks as he confesses his terror of losing her. But our deepest fears are rarely just about love. His agony is heavily driven by a terrifying, obsessive need to maintain absolute, unbroken control over his fiercely guarded world. You and I are going to unpack this moment together, because the shadows hide a dangerous shift. Mara drops to her knees on the rug, immediately becoming the anchor. She forces Dante's dark, frantic eyes to meet hers, softly washing away his imagined sins. By telling him he is her only sanctuary, she unknowingly chains her fragile self-worth to a profoundly dangerous man. His reaction is immediate and completely primal. He hauls her onto his lap, caging her against his chest. His voice is a low rumble as he vows to never let her out of his sight for the next 30 days. On the surface, this feels like tear-jerking, sweeping romance. But true love requires freedom. Underneath the beautiful poetry, we are watching a damaged king demanding total ownership of his most prized asset. The camera lingers on Mara as a soft laugh spills from her lips. He just threatened to lock her away, and she actually finds it comforting. We have all sought shelter in the wrong arms. When the winter gets too bitter, she leans into his chest, whispering for him to ask her, again, feeding the dark loop they both desperately crave. Dante's chest rises with a sharp breath. The low hum of the city fades as his hand slips toward the nightstand, tracing the velvet box he has hidden for weeks. The lid snaps open with a sharp click. A single diamond catches the ambient light. When he speaks her full name, it is not a beautiful proposal. It is a heavy iron gate swinging shut. He is sealing his absolute, irreversible ownership of her soul, one deliberate syllable at a time. Watch the shadows play across Dante's jawline as he frames this marriage as a choice. His voice drops to a rough whisper, claiming, she is the only reason he wants to be a better man. It is a breathtaking manipulation, placing the crushing weight of his redemption directly onto her fragile shoulders. The most dangerous lies we ever swallow are the ones beautifully wrapped in love. Mara finally breaks. Hot tears spill down her face as she eagerly helps him forge the iron bars of her own cage. Hours later, tangled in the dark sheets, the silent contract is sealed. She lies awake in the quiet room, staring at the diamond's harsh light, reflecting on the ceiling, mistaking its cold glare for purity. She whispers about a wedding date, frantic to lock the door against her own shattered mind. The lens focuses on Mara's trembling fingers as she begs for a public wedding. It reveals a tragic truth. When we fully surrender our freedom, we desperately need the crowd to applaud, convincing us it was our own brilliant idea. Dante's lips curve into a chilling smile. The trap is sprung. He agrees to a rushed timeline, quietly isolating her entirely inside his flawless illusion. That night, the nightmares of her past abuser finally vanish. She sleeps deeply, unaware she has simply traded a blunt monster for an artist of control. Beside her, Dante remains wide awake. Bathed in cold moonlight, his dark eyes trace the pulse in her throat. It is not romance in his gaze. It is the silent, terrifying pride of a predator admiring his permanently secured territory. Come with me as we shift our gaze. In the quiet of his mansion, Dante actually believes he can wash the blood from his knuckles and become a holy savior. But true villains always cast themselves as the hero. Miles away, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a holding cell, Gavin sits entirely defeated. His empire of mind games has collapsed. Staring at the grey paint, a tear rolls down his bruised cheek. He is not mourning the loss of a woman. She was just a disposable pawn. He is mourning the loss of his mirror. You and I must understand this final, dark truth about cruelty. A tyrant never cries because they miss the love they lost. They weep because they can no longer see their own terrifying power reflecting back at them in the wide, fearful eyes of their chosen victim. The screen fades up 2 months later. Notice the golden sunlight pouring over the floor, thick with the scent of rich espresso. Mara opens her eyes. Downstairs, the clipped tones of Sarafina echo through the halls, bleeding into the rumble of a truck outside. For anyone else, it is just noise. But for a heart that has only ever known chaos, this rigid structure feels like a warm embrace. She lies still, letting the heavy machinery of this criminal family anchor her soul. Lifting her hand, she watches the diamond catch the morning rays. It no longer feels heavy. It feels like part of her bone. It is a profound, invisible tragedy when we finally learn to love the chains that bind us. Wearing them so proudly, we forget what it was like to walk without them. The prism of light dancing on the wall works like a pendulum, hypnotizing her into this beautiful lie. In 3 days, she will walk down an aisle she truly believes she designed. She picked the silk. She chose the flowers. But the most secure prisons are always the ones we build with our own hands, thinking we are decorating a home. Once, marriage was a suffocating nightmare. Now, she races toward an organized criminal with breathless excitement. The camera follows her bared feet down the sprawling staircase. There he is. Dante sits at the sunlit kitchen table, reading glasses on his nose, blowing softly on a cup of dark coffee. A serene portrait of a husband. The greatest trick the devil ever played was pouring a morning espresso and smiling gently at his captive. Hear the scrape of the wooden chair as Dante looks up. The warming shift in his dark eyes acts like a direct hit of adrenaline to her veins, keeping her addicted to his gaze. They murmur soft greetings, but then the atmosphere chills. Dante slowly folds the newspaper flat against the table. He tells her Gavin's trial is set for January. Zoom in on Mara's hand. It freezes mid-air, the coffee cup trembling a fraction of an inch as the old terror floods her system. Miles away, her former torment is breaking. Denied bail and crushed beneath his monstrous crimes, Gavin Vale's arrogant fortress has crumbled. Justice is a relentless machine. But when it finally catches a man who believed he was a god, it grinds him down into nothing but ordinary, pathetic bone and fear. Stay with me here, because you and I are watching the tragedy pivot. Dante leans in close, his voice smooth as glass, offering an easy way out. He tells her she never has to face that courtroom. But Mara squares her shoulders, refusing to hide in the shadows anymore. She is exhausted from letting a ghost haunt her mind. By choosing the witness stand, she takes a desperate swing at reclaiming her soul. Remember this in your own life. If you do not take the pen, someone else will gladly write your ending. Dante reaches out, tracing her jaw, promising he will never leave her side. The camera pulls back, showing them framed perfectly in the morning light. One terrible cycle of abuse is ending, while a far darker, velvet-lined cage quietly snaps shut around her. Let us look closely at this dynamic together. The heavy doors swing open, and Serafina sweeps into the room. Her silver hair is pulled back so tightly it looks like a weapon, mirroring a soul demanding absolute control. She begins issuing orders, weaponizing the daily schedule to ensure everyone remains dependent on her. Watch Mara's shoulders drop. It is the tragic reflex of a survivor trying to please the predator in the room. Dante simply hides a dark, knowing smirk behind his porcelain cup. Serafina barks at Mara to handle the syndicate's affairs, casually dismissing her own son. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare. True power rarely needs a drawn gun. It thrives in the quiet, methodical theft of a person's simple daily choices. The click of Serafina's heels fades, and the suffocating air releases. Mara lets out a shaky breath, turning to Dante, desperately needing him to make sense of the madness. Dante leans back, casually comparing his mother's cruelty to the quiet terrors his own father endured. He dresses the poison up as family history. This twisted bonding draws a genuine laugh from Mara. The harsh lines of Dante's face melt into something resembling true affection. Mara feels a lump form in her throat, mistaking this shared darkness for the light of healing. She rests her hand on his chest, overwhelmed with gratitude for the safety he pretends to offer. We all search the dark for a lighthouse, even if the light belongs to a burning ship. Dante captures her hand, pressing his mouth to her palm. It is a tender, devastating seal on her loyalty. Over the next 3 days, the camera spins through a montage of terrifying perfection. The estate is transformed. Delicate lights are woven through the dark leaves, and velvet chairs are lined up like soldiers marching toward an archway of white roses. Mara grew those roses herself, trying to plant something beautiful in a bed of poison. Standing on the balcony, looking down at the sea of gold and crisp linen, the world blurs. A cold wave of detachment washes over her. She is a ghost watching her own capture. Yet when Serafina commands the lawn below like a general, Mara forces a bright smile, loudly praising the gorgeous, suffocating design of her new cage. Serafina paces the marble floor, her cold eyes scanning Mara. Mara confesses her chest is tight with dread. Instead of comforting her, the matriarch smiles, twisting that terror into a badge of honor, claiming fear is just loyalty in its rawest form. Listen to how Serafina speaks of her son. She details Dante's violent temper, chilling grudges, and towering ego. Then, with devastating precision, she reframes those red flags into a twisted shield. She tells Mara that his psychotic obsession is the very thing that will keep her safe. The camera pushes in. Mara's eyes fill with tears as she nods, embracing her own subjugation. It is a heartbreaking flaw of the human condition. We will forgive the darkest danger, as long as it softly whispers that it loves us. The camera lingers on heavy shadows stretching across the floor. Serafina ordered her to rest, but sleep is an impossible luxury for a nervous system on fire. Mara stands near the glass, hypervigilance vibrating through her posture. The reality of her situation is tearing her mind apart. In mere hours, she will bind herself to a man capable of supreme violence. Old scars left by her former abuser flare up, flooding her mind with intrusive memories. Her subconscious screams that she is only trading a rusted cell for an opulent cage of gold. Seeking an anchor, she stares at the artificially lit leaves outside. Without a sound, the heavy door behind her unlatches. True freedom, we must remember, is rarely found by simply upgrading the aesthetic quality of your cage. Dante steps into the dim frame, breaching her isolation. The light catches the sheer exhaustion carved into his face as he gently interrogates her emotional state. Backed into a corner by her own defense mechanisms, Mara takes a terrifying leap into pure vulnerability. She confesses the terror of repetition compulsion. She is paralyzed by the thought that she is subconsciously recreating her original trauma with a different monster. Dante processes this shattering revelation with chilling, absolute calm. He does not lash out with wounded pride. Instead, he executes a masterful grounding technique. He forces her to look at him, demanding she consciously access her own grueling 3-year study of abusive pathology and red flags to see the truth. Watch the frame closely. You and I are about to witness a masterclass in psychological dismantling. Dante directly challenges her threat assessment, his voice low and steady. He demands she quantify a single maladaptive behavior he has aimed at her. He runs through a diagnostic checklist of coercive control. The answer is nothing. He systematically shatters her projection. Mara crumbles, confessing a paralyzing fear of confirmation bias. Terrified, her broken mind cannot spot the predator in the room. Dante closes the distance, capturing her trembling hands to anchor her in the present. He readily admits to his innate aggression and despotic need for control. Yet, he draws an absolute boundary at hurting her. Self-awareness is always the sharpest tool a dangerous man can wield. He issues a psychological contract right in the shadows, swearing never to activate her fear response. He demands she vocalize boundary violations, desperate to avoid becoming the persecutor she dreads. The camera captures her ragged breathing as she explains the trauma freeze response, a complete nervous system shut down. Dante counters with a collaborative framework proposing clinical therapy and endless dialogue. His voice betrays a raw, human urgency as he begs her to sever the neurological link connecting him to her abuser. Mara studies this lethal man, analyzing the paradox of a killer who built an impenetrable sanctuary for her shattered mind. We learn quickly that true sanctuary is only built when a powerful force consciously restrains its own capacity for destruction. The camera frames the exact moment she gives in, a tiny nod that echoes in the quiet room. It is a terrifying surrender to trust. Dante pulls her into his chest, his arms locking around her in a desperate embrace. You can almost feel the warmth overriding her hard-wired trauma. Press it against his shoulder. Mara finally accepts a radical truth. She does not have to be punished just to exist. He whispers a ragged vow against her hair, binding 2 fractured souls together in the dark. But peace is fleeting. As the harsh morning sun bleeds through the curtains, Mara's heart hammers a brutal rhythm. Seraphina steps into the room, sliding a bitter cup of black coffee onto the nightstand. The suffocating metamorphosis into syndicate property has begun. Sometimes, accepting love is the most dangerous risk a person can take. The lens pulls back to reveal Mara drowning in heavy ivory silk. It is a beautiful garment, yet designed to project pure compliance. The matriarch hovers in the periphery, her cold eyes tracking every adjustment. By 2 in the afternoon, the isolation becomes absolute. Mara stands at the edge of the estate, the distant clinking of crystal and low murmurs of the syndicate bleeding into her ears. Her hands begin to shake. She forces her palms together, burying the panic deep down. Then, heavy footsteps shatter the silence. Luca, the scarred enforcer, steps into the light, looking out of place in a dark suit. He gruffly relays the boss's order to move. Mara's throat closes. Cut off from her past, she is left agonizingly exposed to the jaws of this new world. We are never more fragile than when we stand utterly alone. She spent months training her mind to face the fire alone, yet she takes the enforcer's arm without hesitation. As they walk, Luca mutters something unexpected. Dante is nervous. Hearing that the devil himself is shaken gives Mara a strange grounding, validating her own crushing terror. Luca's voice drops low, reminding her that there is no turning back from this. The air shifts as a haunting string quartet bleeds into the courtyard. Mara takes a slow, agonizing breath and crosses the threshold. The entire criminal empire rises to its feet, but the camera blurs them all out. Her eyes lock solely on the apex predator waiting beneath the arch. Just for a second, Dante's cold mask cracks, revealing the desperate, very human obsession burning underneath. Let us remember this: true vulnerability is impossible to hide, no matter how thick the armor. Luca gives her hand one rough squeeze before trading her to the man in the light. Dante's large hand secures hers. The camera pushes in, catching the stark dilation of his pupils. The officiant speaks, but the words turn into dead static. Auditory exclusion takes over Mara's brain. The only reality left is the desperate friction of his thumbs against her skin. Their trembling hands mirror one another. Then, Dante speaks his vows. He strips away his armor right there on the altar, confessing how he always viewed love as a fatal tactical error, a weakness to be exploited. He tears his own ruthless worldview down to the studs, admitting that she alone forced him to rebuild it. Watching a hardened killer willingly drop his iron shield is a chilling, beautiful sight. The deepest lesson of the heart is that true love demands we completely surrender our defenses. Dante's deep voice carries a total rejection of the blood and fear that once ruled his existence. He stares down at her, redefining what it means to be strong. To him, her ability to simply breathe after enduring catastrophic trauma is the peak of human endurance. In a tragic, poetic turn, he compares her quiet garden work to the impossible miracle of dead things coming back to life. His voice actually breaks, a rough tearing sound, as he swears his oath. He pledges to become the walls that keep the wolves out. He promises to channel his violence solely toward their enemies, vowing the monster inside him will never look her way. He commits to choosing her every morning above his own survival. When you find the one who grounds your soul, laying down your ego is no longer a sacrifice, it is a salvation. Come close and let us evaluate this climax together. Dante delivers his devotion not as a promise, but as an inescapable law of nature. Mara answers with heavy tears, utterly overwhelmed by the sudden safety of his shadow. The camera lingers on her trembling lips as she speaks of the girl she was months ago. A shattered thing constantly running, begging for a single night of peace. Her fingers dig into his palms as she lists his silent mercies. He built a fortress around her without demanding she heal on his schedule. He watched her night terrors and never once looked away. He simply held the beams steady while she rebuilt her own ruined house. You and I have to recognize the beauty in this final truth. The most profound acts of love do not rescue a person. They simply provide the quiet space needed for them to save themselves. Observe her now as the camera pulls tight on her face. Her voice trembles, vibrating with a raw, bleeding emotion that cuts through the silence. She looks him in the eyes and declares she is no longer the broken thing he found in the dirt. She is actively fighting her own instincts, choosing to trust the ground beneath her feet instead of waiting for the trapdoor to open. She pauses, wiping a tear from her cheek. We must understand this vital lesson. Trauma is a cage we build to survive the worst days, but healing is the heavy iron door we alone must choose to open. She vows to stand beside him as an equal, not as a fragile liability hiding behind a bodyguard. Dante's jaw locks tight in pure, beautiful agony, his dark eyes brimming with unshed tears. Sometimes, the sharpest broken pieces fit together to create something unbreakable. Walk with me as we watch this scene unfold. The second the officiant seals the union, Dante abandons protocol. He drags Mara to his chest, kissing her with the violent, starving desperation of a man breaking the surface for air. The garden explodes into applause, a cheerful mask over the heavy trauma bonding them together. As they pull apart, Mara lets out a breathless, tearful laugh, the ultimate proof that she has decided to live. "Mrs. Veyron," he murmurs, his tone rough. "Mr. Veyron," she confirms. This is the exact moment she stops running and actively stakes a claim on her own life. Soon, the reception blurs into a surreal sort of normalcy. Serafina raises a glass, her toast rapping a literal death threat against Dante in fierce affection. Family is not always blood. Often, it is the fiercely protective pack we form to survive the deep darkness. Picture the scene with me. You and I are watching from the cold shadows of the terrace. Luca raises his glass, his scarred jaw tight. He mutters that Dante has grown soft, a dangerous shift in a world where mercy is a fatal wound. But out on the polished floor, Dante and Mara are alone in a crowded room, swaying to a silent rhythm. The camera lingers on the heavy weight of his hand resting on her waist, her face hidden against his dark suit. "Happy?" Dante murmurs into her hair. "Terrified," Mara whispers, "but happy." Her muscles still hum with the ghost of past abuse. A tragic reflex, bracing for a strike. Dante cups her cheek, his thumb dragging across her jaw. "The fear just means it matters," he tells her quietly. They hold that fragile frame of peace. Sometimes, the truest, most terrifying proof of love is finally having something you cannot bear to lose. The bedroom is drowned in cold moonlight, spilling through the heavy glass. Mara stands rigid by the window, her dark eyes tracking the shadows of the garden. She is anchoring her mind to the soil, searching for physical proof that this sanctuary won't vanish at sunrise. From the pitch-black corners, Dante steps silently behind her. His massive chest meets her spine, a living, breathing shield locking out the ghosts of her past. "No regrets?" he asks, the low rumble of his voice vibrating through her bones. "Not one," she breathes into the glass. The silence that follows is heavy, yet entirely empty of danger. When she asks what they do next, his answer is absolute. "Now we live. We build a life." The truth is beautifully brutal. You can never build a solid foundation for your future without first digging your bare hands through the ruins of your past. "I am still scared sometimes," Mara whispers. Her voice trembles like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. She stands in the shadows, holding out her terror not because she wants him to fix it, but as a bleeding confession. Dante simply nods. He does not offer empty platitudes or try to bandage the unhealable. He honors the permanent wound. This is the cinematic pivot, the exact frame where her exhausted mind stops running and finally learns to walk. Cut to 4 months later, the bedroom shadows are violently erased by the clinical glare of a courtroom. An attorney paces the floor like a starving dog, using every vicious tactic to crack her. But Mara sits like stone, Dante anchored beside her. You cannot frighten a woman who has already walked through the fire. True power is not the absence of fear, but the absolute refusal to let it write the script of your life. The gavel slams against the block. The crack echoes like a gunshot across the dead silence of the courtroom. Guilty. 50s. As the judge drives the into the coffin, The camera pans to Gavin. You can almost hear his arrogant spine snap. His face drains to the color of wet ash, his shoulders collapsing as the illusion of his godhood shatters into dust. Ma watches him from the gallery, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Dante. The towering monster who used to blot out her son suddenly looks impossibly small. He is just a hollow, pathetic man in a wrinkled suit. The bailiffs grab his arms, dragging him backward. Gavin twists his neck, his wild eyes locking onto Mara, begging for one last hit of her terror. She gives him absolute nothingness. No anger, no tears. Only the quiet exhale of a survivor closing the book. We feed our monsters with our fear, but we are the only ones who can choose to starve them. Picture the scene with me. You and I are standing in the suffocating chaos of the street. Reporters surge forward like a tidal wave of old nightmares, flashbulbs tearing the dark. Dante is an immovable wall of dark wool and quiet violence, parting the vultures until the CLD inside the blacked-out sedan. The doors slam. Absolute silence drops like an anvil. Mara collapses against the leather, the rigid terror in her jaw melting. "How do you feel?" Dante asks, his voice barely a breath. She watches the blurred city streak across the tinted glass. "Free," she whispers. They return to a garden she pulled from the earth with her own bleeding hands, now exploding in defiant bloom. Healing is a brutal, ugly war, but a surviving soul will always claw its way back to the sun. The lens finds a heavy oak desk, moonlight spilling like cold water to frame Mara in silver. Her pen viciously scratches the parchment. She is dragging agonizing memories from the locked cages of her mind, bleeding them into ink. Dante leans against the doorframe, a silent sentinel wrapped in deep shadows, watching the woman he loves dissect her own ruin. "What are you working on?" he murmurs, careful not to shatter her fragile focus. She pauses, her shoulders rising with a shaky inhale, forging her terror into cold evidence. Dante holds his ground, refusing to read a word until invited. By 4 a.m, only her steady voice breaks the heavy silence. You cannot close the book of your history until you force yourself to read the darkest chapters aloud. Dante steps into the amber light, his massive frame shifting with an awkward vulnerability as he confesses he watches the door while she sleeps. Under the shadow of another man, this would be the suffocating grip of a warden, but the camera lingers on the soft release in Mara's eyes. "It reminds me I am not alone anymore," she whispers, translating the fierce devotion in his gaze. He pulls her from the hard chair, folding her into the heavy, grounding warmth of his chest. She rests her cheek over his heart, sinking her fractured breathing to its deep drum. "I used to think love meant giving up pieces of yourself," she murmurs into the dark. "True devotion never demands you shrink into the shadows. It stands as a towering shield, helping you carry the heavy sky. Stick with me here. You and I are going to push the timeline 6 months forward. The sun is golden, the house is quiet, and the illusion of safety feels absolute." Then, the camera pans down to the heavy oak table. A white envelope sits there, a venomous stain on the perfect picture. No return address. Just the erratic, violent scratch of a familiar handwriting. As Mara slides her trembling finger under the flap, you can almost hear the deafening rush of panicked blood in her ears. The dormant terror reignites in a blinding flash. The ghost of her abuser has crawled to her front door. It is a cruel reminder of a brutal truth. No matter how thick the fortress walls you build, your dark history always demands one last conversation before it truly sets you free. The paper shakes in her grip as her eyes scan the cruel, jagged ink. Gavin writes that this letter is a mandated exercise, a cowardly attempt to hide behind the cold walls of institutional therapy. He refuses to shoulder his guilt, weaving a careful apology to drag her back into the dark gravity of his twisted world. Stripped of his power and locked in a concrete cell, he is forced to stare into the terrifying, empty mirror of his own mind. "I was a monster," the ink screams across the page. It is a textbook confession from a shattered ego. He spent years pouring his sickness into her soul because he was entirely hollow inside. Hurt people will instinctively bleed on others, but simply acknowledging your poison is a far cry from actually doing the brutal work to drink the cure. The final lines drip with the manipulative poison of a fallen tyrant. He signs off hoping she is free, playing the tragic martyr. Mara lowers the parchment. The muscles in her jaw are astonishingly relaxed. The camera tracks her slow, deliberate footsteps toward the stone fireplace. She strikes a match. The flame flares, casting long shadows against the walls. She drops the letter onto the logs, watching the edges curl, turn black, and dissolve into ash. This is the climax of her agonizing tragedy. There is no triumphant smile or sudden rush of revenge. She stares at the burning ghost of her abuser and feels absolutely nothing. Apathy is her undeniable victory. True closure arrives when the fire that once burned your entire world to the ground lacks the power to even warm your hands. Dante steps out of the firelight, his dark eyes locking onto the crumbling ash. "What was that?" he asks, his voice a gentle rumble. Mara watches the final spark die. "The past," she murmurs, finally letting go of me. He wraps his arms around her in a grounding embrace. "Look close at the screen with me. You and I are about to witness a true transformation." She closes her eyes, running a silent inventory of her soul. The shattered girl from 3 years ago is gone. In her place stands a forged in hellfire, anchored by a man who treats her the metals as of a terrible war. "Like I can finally breathe," she whispers into the dark. The scene cuts to black, skipping forward 12 quiet months. Healing demands agonizing patience, but one day, the suffocating air simply becomes oxygen again. The morning mist hangs heavy over the garden, dawn light painting the world in soft blues. Dante shuffles onto the stone patio, his broad shoulders relaxed. There is no armor today, no hidden weapons, just the quiet vulnerability of a man at peace. He steps behind Mara, sliding a warm arm around her waist. He kisses her temple, gently asking if the ghosts had chased her from sleep. Mara leans back into his chest, her eyes tracing the blooming flowers she planted with her own scarred hands. A soft smile touches her lips. "No," she murmurs, lighter than the breeze. "Good ones." "Actually, I dreamed about the future. The agonizing tragedy is over. The curtain falls on a life no longer focused on surviving the dark. The absolute greatest defiance against a violently broken past is daring to build a beautiful tomorrow." The camera pulls a tight focus on Mara. Morning light catches the subtle, beautiful softening of her jawline. She looks at Dante, her eyes steady, holding no lingering ghosts. "You make me happy," she whispers, carrying the weight of a quiet victory. "The future makes me happy." This is no cheap fairy tale. This is the brutal work of a shattered mind rewriting its own survival code. Sunlight spills over the roses she planted with her scarred hands, living proof of how life claws its way back from total ash. She is no longer the hunted, trembling thing her abuser left behind. The lesson in this cinematic frame is undeniable. No matter how viciously the darkness cuts your soul, the human need to heal will always shatter the concrete and reach for the sun. Let the camera linger on the quiet space between them. The deep grooves of trauma do not wash away overnight. The cold echoes of her abuser still sleep within her mind, those cruel whispers that told her she was nothing. Yet, as Dante reaches out to gently brush a lock of hair from her cheek, we witness something profound. She doesn't flinch. She leans into his warmth. She thanks him, her voice trembling just a fraction, for holding her when she felt completely hollow. Dante is the towering anchor pulling her back to reality, proving her value was never lost. There is a simple truth hiding in this scene for all of us. The monsters who violently break, you never get to decide what your soul is worth. Recognizing that fact is the very first step out of the blinding dark. In the cinematic stillness of this garden, we witness the absolute ruin of Gavin's design. He wanted her reduced to ashes, entirely dependent on his suffocating shadow. But watch her now. She holds a warm ceramic mug, closing her eyes to smell the bitter coffee and feel the crisp wind against her neck. She is anchoring herself to the pulse of the now, piecing the shattered glass of her timeline back together. Surviving a monster doesn't mean forgetting he existed. It means taking the ugliest, terrifying parts of your history and forcing them to sit quite tightly in a dark corner of your mind. If we take anything away from her quiet triumph, it is this undeniable lesson. The blackened ruins of your absolute worst days can actually become the solid stone you use to build your safest sanctuary. Lean in and stick with me, because you and I need to look closely at a man like Gavin. He was a master architect of human despair. He buried Mara alive under a suffocating blanket of fear, making her believe she needed his toxic air to breathe. But the human soul is beautifully stubborn. It doesn't die under the crushing weight of abuse. It just holds its breath in the dark. With Dante standing steady beside her, Mara dug her own spirit out of the dirt. She took back the wheel. That is the true climax of this cinematic story. Trauma robs you of your choices, leaving you completely paralyzed. But stepping back into the light means realizing that every time you open your eyes, you hold the power to choose hope over terror and absolute freedom over quiet submission. The camera slowly pulls back, leaving the tight close-ups behind. We hold on a wide shot of Mara, surrounded by a sea of heavy, blood-red roses. You might expect a tragedy like this to end with screaming vengeance, the victim trapped in blind rage. But true defiance is silent. Just look at her posture in the golden light. Her shoulders sit low and soft. The dirt on her hands is just dark earth, completely free of blood. Gavin tried to destroy her, yet here she is, coaxing beauty from the dirt he meant to be her grave. Her tired heart has finally forgotten how to run. The breathing truth of this final frame is simple. The only way to truly defeat those who tried to break you is to build a life so full of light that their shadows burn away before they can even touch you.